Hey there, mystery hunters. Today we're going on a 12-chapter journey through the secrets America doesn't advertise on its postcards. You know the story you learned in school: noble revolutionaries, inspiring monuments, and founding fathers who could do no wrong? Yeah, we're about to flip that script harder than a conspiracy theorist at a government hearing, because it turns out the land of the free was built on smuggling rings, secret societies, missing time capsules, and possibly interdimensional Bigfoot. I'm not making this up. Before we dive into this rabbit hole that goes deeper than the Marianas Trench, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about American history. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to know who's brave enough to join me on this wild ride from revolutionary taverns to paranormal forests. Buckle up. We've got founding fathers with rigged pistols, vanishing cornerstones, deified presidents, and cryptids that might be spirits from another dimension. If you thought you knew America, you're about to find out you've been reading the tourist brochure. Let's get into it. So let's talk about the American Revolution, shall we? You know the version you got in school: noble patriots rising up against tyranny, fighting for freedom and liberty with tears streaming down their faces while eagles screamed overhead. Beautiful story, inspiring stuff. Also conveniently leaving out the fact that a huge chunk of these so-called patriots were basically running an illegal import business and were absolutely furious that the British government was about to kill their profit margins. That's right. The spark that lit the powder keg of American independence wasn't just about taxation, without representation or the yearning for freedom. It was about cold, hard cash and a very illegal tea trade that was making certain colonists extremely wealthy. And when the British Crown decided to hand over a total monopoly on tea sales to the East India Company in 1773, they didn't just step on some toes. They basically took a sledgehammer to an entire underground economy that had been thriving in the colonies for decades. Let's set the scene here. Colonial America in the 1760s and early 1770s was running on tea like a modern office runs on coffee. And I mean running on it. The average colonist was drinking multiple cups per day. We're talking about a society that would probably have staged a revolution over Netflix removing their favourite show, except their favourite show was hot leaf water. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a social ritual, a status symbol, and basically the entire economy of social gatherings. You couldn't have a proper colonial conversation without tea any more than you can have a modern conversation without checking your phone every 30 seconds. Here's where it gets interesting. The legal tea coming from Britain through the East India Company was expensive. Really expensive. We're talking luxury item expensive because it had to travel halfway around the world, get taxed multiple times, pass through British merchants who all wanted their cut, and then get shipped across the Atlantic with more taxes piled on top. By the time it reached colonial shelves, legal British tea cost roughly twice what smuggled tea cost. And unsurprisingly, colonists weren't exactly lining up to pay double for the exact same product just because King George said they should. Enter the smugglers. These weren't exactly the swashbuckling pirates you're picturing. Most of them were respectable merchants who just happened to have a very flexible relationship with customs regulations. They'd import tea from the Dutch, from the French, from literally anyone who wasn't British, and they'd do it through every creative loophole and shadowy harbour you can imagine. Some ships would offload their cargo in the middle of the night onto smaller boats. Others would bribe customs officials, which wasn't particularly hard because those officials were often making about as much as a modern fast food worker, and were therefore very open to supplemental income. The whole system was basically held together by bribes, winks, and the colonial equivalent of "I didn't see anything," and business was booming. Historians estimate that by the early 1770s, somewhere between 75 and 90% of tea consumed in the colonies was smuggled. That's not a typo. 9 out of 10 tea parties in colonial America were technically criminal enterprises. Your grandmother's respectable tea gathering, probably funded by illegal Dutch imports. The irony is almost too perfect. A society that would go on to found itself on law and order was running almost entirely on contraband. Now here's where the British government made what might be the single dumbest business decision in colonial history. In 1773 they passed the Tea Act. And no, this wasn't the one that added taxes. That was the Townshend Acts from a few years earlier, which the colonists were already furious about. The Tea Act actually removed some taxes to make British tea cheaper. Sounds good, right? The problem was it also gave the East India Company a complete monopoly. They could now sell directly to the colonies without going through colonial merchants, and they could undercut everyone else's prices because they had the backing of the world's most powerful empire. The British government thought they were being clever. They'd make their tea so cheap that even smuggled tea couldn't compete. The colonists would start buying legal tea again, and everyone would calm down and go back to being proper British subjects. Problem solved, rebellion averted, tax revenue restored. Except they forgot one tiny detail. They were about to put every major merchant in the colonies out of business. Think about it from the smuggler's perspective. You've spent years building up this profitable trade network. You've got connections, suppliers, customers, distribution routes. You're making good money, supporting your family, living a respectable life. And then suddenly Parliament decides your entire business model is illegal and hands your market share to a government-backed corporation that you can't possibly compete with. It's like if Amazon suddenly got permission to sell everything tax-free while simultaneously making it illegal for anyone else to operate an online store. You'd be furious too. And these weren't small-time operators we're talking about. Some of the wealthiest, most influential men in the colonies had their fortunes tied up in smuggling. John Hancock, yes, the guy with the famously large signature on the Declaration of Independence, was one of the richest merchants in Massachusetts, and a significant chunk of his wealth came from smuggled goods. His ship, the Liberty, had been seized by British customs in 1768 for smuggling, which sparked riots in Boston. The man wasn't just a patriot fighting for freedom. He was a businessman fighting for his profit margins, though that's not exactly what gets taught in elementary school history. So when the Tea Act passed, these merchants didn't just get angry, they got organised. And where did they organise? In taverns, naturally, because where else would 18th century businessmen plot revolutionary acts? This was an era before conference rooms, before encrypted messaging apps, before even telegraph systems. If you wanted to have a secret meeting, you went to a tavern, ordered some ale, and hoped the guy at the next table wasn't a British informant. Very sophisticated security protocol. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston became basically the unofficial headquarters of colonial resistance. They called it the headquarters of the revolution, which is either really bold or really stupid, depending on how much you value operational security. This wasn't some dive bar either. It was owned by the Freemasons, which we'll get into in the next chapter, but just know that these weren't random drunks stumbling around complaining about taxes. These were organised, connected, powerful men who knew exactly what they were doing. And what they were doing was planning the Boston Tea Party, though they didn't call it that at the time. They called it the destruction of the tea, which is honestly way more metal and should have stuck as the name. Picture this. It's December 1773, and 3 ships loaded with East India Company tea are sitting in Boston Harbour. The Sons of Liberty, which sounds like a superhero team but was actually a network of colonial activists and, let's be honest, smugglers, have decided that this tea is absolutely not getting unloaded and sold. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was probably having the worst month of his career, refused to send the ships back to Britain. The tea had to be unloaded and the taxes paid within 20 days, or customs officials would seize it and sell it themselves. So the clock was ticking, tensions were rising, and the taverns were absolutely buzzing with plans. On the night of December 16th, somewhere between 100 and 150 men gathered. They disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, which seems deeply problematic now but apparently made sense to them at the time, as a way to hide their identities and maybe shift blame. Modern costume choice? Absolutely terrible. Effective for their purposes. Apparently because British authorities had a surprisingly hard time identifying the participants afterward, despite the fact that this happened in a city where everyone basically knew everyone else. They boarded the 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, and over the course of 3 hours they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbour. We're talking about roughly £92,000 of tea, worth about £18,000 sterling at the time, which would be several $1,000,000 today. They didn't steal any of it, which was important to them because they wanted to make clear this was political protest, not piracy. Very principled destruction of property. They even swept the decks clean afterward and reportedly replaced a padlock they accidentally broke. Polite vandalism. The interesting thing is how organised this was. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. This was a carefully planned operation with specific targets, clear objectives, and strict rules of engagement. Nobody was supposed to get hurt, nothing else was supposed to get damaged, and the whole thing was supposed to send a very specific message. We will not be forced to buy your monopoly tea, and we will absolutely destroy it rather than let it be sold. The British government's response was about what you'd expect when someone dumps a fortune in tea into a harbour. They lost their minds. They passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbour, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and basically put the colony under military occupation. These laws were meant to punish Massachusetts and warn the other colonies that rebellion wouldn't be tolerated. Instead, they united the colonies in outrage faster than a controversial tweet unites Twitter. Suddenly, what had started as a Boston problem became an American problem. And here's the thing that often gets lost in the traditional telling of this story. The people who organized and executed the Boston Tea Party weren't necessarily motivated by pure ideological commitment to liberty. Many of them had very direct financial interests in preventing the East India Company from establishing its monopoly. John Hancock stood to lose a fortune. Other merchants were in the same boat, literally and figuratively. They wrapped their economic self-interest in the language of liberty and rights, which is brilliant marketing if nothing else. Now, does that make their actions less valid? Not necessarily. Sometimes the right thing to do happens to also be the profitable thing to do, and that's perfectly fine. The colonists weren't wrong about taxation without representation being unfair. They weren't wrong about Parliament overreaching its authority. They weren't wrong about the dangers of unchecked corporate monopolies. Turns out the East India Company was basically the Amazon of its day, except with more opium and colonialism. The fact that they also happened to be protecting their illegal smuggling operations doesn't negate the legitimate grievances they had. What it does do is complicate the neat, clean narrative we usually get about the revolution. The founding of America wasn't just about noble ideals descending from heaven onto the blessed heads of patriot philosophers. It was about merchants who were mad their profit margins were threatened, landowners who didn't want to pay taxes, smugglers who didn't want to go to prison, and lawyers who saw opportunity in chaos. They channeled all of that self-interest into a revolutionary movement that genuinely did create something new and remarkable, but the spark that lit it all? That came from a tavern full of angry businessmen who were about to lose their shirts. The tavern conspiracies that preceded the revolution weren't just planning sessions, they were networking events where economic interests aligned with political philosophy. These men would sit around drinking ale and discussing John Locke's theories of natural rights, sure, but they were also definitely discussing shipping routes, Dutch tea prices, and which customs officials could be bribed. It was political philosophy meets business strategy meets criminal conspiracy, all happening over pints of beer in smoke-filled rooms, and the network they built through these tavern meetings became the infrastructure of the revolution. The same routes used to smuggle tea would later smuggle weapons. The same men who coordinated illegal trade would coordinate military resistance. The same taverns where they planned the destruction of tea would become meeting places for Sons of Liberty chapters across the colonies. The whole underground economy they'd built for smuggling transformed into an underground rebellion almost overnight. The British never really understood what they were dealing with. They thought they were facing scattered protests from ungrateful colonists who didn't appreciate the protection and stability the empire provided. What they were actually facing was an organised network of experienced smugglers who had been evading British law for years and had now decided to stop evading and start fighting. These weren't amateurs stumbling into rebellion. They were professionals who knew how to operate covertly, move goods and people without detection, and coordinate complex operations across multiple colonies. So when you think about the American Revolution, remember that it didn't start with a shot heard round the world. It started with merchants doing math and realizing they were about to be bankrupted by a monopoly. It started in taverns where men with expensive wigs drank too much and decided that maybe, just maybe, they'd be better off running their own country, where they could set their own trade policies and protect their own economic interests. The lofty ideals of liberty and democracy came later, or rather, they were always there, but they became a lot more urgent when people's bank accounts were threatened. The Boston Tea Party was revolutionary not because it was heroic, it was revolutionary because it was effective. It united economic interests across different colonies, forced merchants and smugglers to commit publicly to resistance, and showed that organised civil disobedience could work. It also completely destroyed any chance of peaceful reconciliation between the colonies and Britain, which was probably the point. And here's the final irony. The country these smugglers helped create would go on to have very complicated feelings about smuggling. The same men who dumped tea in the harbour would later write laws against smuggling and create customs services to enforce them. John Hancock, smuggler extraordinaire, would become president of the Continental Congress and governor of Massachusetts, where he'd have to deal with people doing to his government exactly what he'd done to the British government. The rebels became the establishment, and the establishment does not typically appreciate being rebelled against. But in 1773, none of that had happened yet. In 1773, there were just angry merchants in taverns, plotting to destroy some tea and accidentally starting a revolution. They thought they were protecting their businesses. They thought they were standing up to corporate monopoly and government overreach. They were absolutely right about both those things. They just didn't realise they were also lighting the fuse on something much bigger than a tax protest. The American Revolution was born in those taverns, amid the smoke and ale and heated discussions about liberty and profit margins, because in colonial America, those two things were basically the same thing. And while history books tend to emphasise the liberty part and downplay the profit margins, both were equally real and equally important to the people involved. They wanted freedom, sure. But they also wanted to keep making money selling smuggled tea, and honestly, can you blame them? Now that we've established that the American Revolution was partly funded by angry smugglers protecting their tea profits, let's talk about the organisational infrastructure that made the whole rebellion possible. Because those tavern conspiracies we just discussed, they weren't happening in random bars. They were happening in Masonic lodges and Masonic-owned establishments, coordinated by men who'd sworn blood oaths of secrecy and loyalty to each other. The American Revolution wasn't just fought by farmers with muskets. It was coordinated by the 18th century's equivalent of a secret society, with built-in encryption, a hierarchy of trust, and meeting houses conveniently located in every major colonial city. Let's be clear about something up front. The Freemasons weren't exactly hiding their involvement in the revolution. They were pretty open about it, actually. But what people don't fully appreciate is how perfectly suited Masonic organisational structure was for running a conspiracy against the British Crown. These weren't just social clubs where guys got together to drink and talk philosophy. Masonic lodges were ready-made resistance cells with everything a revolutionary movement could want. Secrecy protocols, loyalty oaths enforced by threats of gruesome symbolic punishment, a hierarchical structure for compartmentalizing information, and a network that spanned all 13 colonies plus connections back to Europe. The genius of using Masonic infrastructure for revolution is that it was already there. You didn't have to build a conspiracy network from scratch, you just repurposed the existing one. Masons already knew how to hold secret meetings. They already had passwords, hand signals, and recognition codes to identify each other. They already met regularly without arousing suspicion because Masonic meeting was a perfectly normal explanation for why a bunch of prominent men were gathering in a closed room. It's like if you wanted to organise a modern resistance movement and discovered you could just use existing Rotary clubs, except the Rotary clubs had mystical initiation rites and threatened to cut your throat if you betrayed the Brotherhood. The philosophical foundations of Freemasonry were also perfectly aligned with revolutionary sentiment. Masonic teachings emphasized equality among brothers regardless of social rank, which was radical in a society with rigid class hierarchies. They rejected the divine right of kings in favor of a great architect of the universe who operated through natural laws and reason. They valued geometry and mathematics as expressions of universal truth, which fits into Enlightenment thinking about rational governance. Their whole symbolic system was about transforming rough stones into perfect cubes, literal and metaphorical self-improvement through knowledge and virtue. If you were going to design a secret society to inspire democratic revolution, you'd basically create Freemasonry. And the Founding Fathers weren't just casual members, we're talking about deep involvement at the highest levels. George Washington was a Master Mason, Benjamin Franklin was a Grand Master, Paul Revere was Grand Master of Massachusetts, John Hancock, our favourite smuggler, was also a prominent Mason. The list goes on. These weren't people who attended a few meetings and let their memberships lapse. They were active, committed Masons who took the philosophy seriously and incorporated it into their world-view. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which we mentioned earlier as the headquarters of revolutionary plotting, was owned by the Masons. The building literally housed St. Andrew's Lodge upstairs. So when the Sons of Liberty met there to plan the Boston Tea Party, they were meeting in a Masonic building, probably coordinated by Masonic members, using organisational skills learned through Masonic participation. The fact that this isn't taught more explicitly in history classes is wild because it's not even hidden information. It's just not emphasized because it complicates the simple narrative of spontaneous popular uprising. Here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. The Masons provided something crucial that random revolutionary enthusiasm couldn't: operational security. When you're plotting to commit treason against the world's most powerful empire, you need to know who you can trust and who might be an informant. Masonic oaths and the whole brotherhood structure solved this problem. If someone was a Mason in good standing, you could reasonably trust them not to betray the cause, because betraying the revolution would also mean betraying their sacred oaths. The penalty for revealing Masonic secrets was supposedly having your throat cut and your tongue torn out. Not actually enforced, obviously, but the symbolism created a powerful psychological bond. The multi-layered structure of Masonic degrees also allowed for compartmentalization of information. Not every Mason needed to know everything about the revolutionary plans. Information could be shared on a need-to-know basis, with higher degrees having access to more sensitive intelligence. It's the same principle modern intelligence agencies use, except wrapped in mystical symbolism and ritual drama. And the rituals themselves served a function beyond just mysticism. The elaborate initiation ceremonies created intense bonding experiences. When you've been blindfolded, led through symbolic death and rebirth, sworn oaths with your hand on the Bible and a compass to your chest, and been welcomed into the brotherhood with specific handshakes and passwords, you feel connected to those men, in a way that casual friendship doesn't achieve. Revolutionary movements need that kind of deep commitment. You need people who will risk their lives and fortunes for the cause, and Masonic Brotherhood created exactly that kind of loyalty. The influence of Masonic philosophy on the founding documents is harder to pin down definitively, but the parallels are striking. The Declaration of Independence talks about self-evident truths and natural rights, which aligns with Masonic emphasis on universal natural law and reason over arbitrary authority. The Constitution's system of checks and balances reflects Masonic principles of balanced forces. The emphasis on religious tolerance and separation of church and state echoes Masonic acceptance of different religious traditions as equally valid paths to the divine. Benjamin Franklin's involvement is particularly interesting because he was deeply embedded in both American and European Masonic networks. He spent years in France, where he joined the prestigious Lodge of the Nine Sisters, rubbing elbows with Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers. This gave him connections that proved crucial when the revolution needed French support. The Masons had international networks that allowed revolutionaries to communicate and coordinate across borders in ways that would have been difficult otherwise. The symbolism on American currency and official seals also shows heavy Masonic influence. The Great Seal of the United States features an unfinished pyramid with an eye and a triangle above it. The all-seeing eye and pyramid are both Masonic symbols. The phrase "Annuit coeptis," he approves our undertakings, and "Novus Ordo Seclorum," New Order of the Ages, have Masonic resonance. The symbolism suggests divine approval of the American project and the creation of a new world order based on Enlightenment principles, which is pure Masonic ideology. Critics and conspiracy theorists have run wild with this Masonic connection, claiming everything from the Masons secretly controlling America to the revolution being a Masonic plot for world domination. The reality is probably more mundane. The Masons provided useful organizational infrastructure and philosophical framework for people who wanted revolution anyway. They didn't cause the revolution so much as they facilitated it and shaped how it was conceptualized and executed. But here's the question nobody wants to answer directly. To what extent was the American Revolution a Masonic project? Were the Masons using the colonial grievances as an opportunity to implement their philosophical vision of governance? Or were revolutionaries simply using Masonic networks because they were available and useful? The answer is probably both, which makes it complicated. Think about it this way. If you're a Mason who believes in equality, rational governance, and rejection of arbitrary royal authority, and you're also a colonist being oppressed by that royal authority, your Masonic beliefs and you're revolutionary. Sentiment aren't separate things. They reinforce each other. The revolution becomes not just a political rebellion, but a sacred mission to implement divine principles of government on Earth. That's heavy stuff. That's crusade-level commitment. The Masonic vision of the ideal society influenced everything from the architecture of Washington, D.C., which we've already covered, to the structure of government to the symbolic language of American identity. The idea that America has a special destiny, that it's meant to be a beacon of liberty and enlightenment to the world, that it represents a new order for the ages, All of this has Masonic overtones. Whether you think that's inspiring or creepy probably depends on your feelings about secret societies having outsized influence on national founding. What's undeniable is that Masonic networks provided coordination, communication, and ideological coherence to the revolutionary movement in ways that would have been much harder to achieve otherwise. The revolution might have happened without the Masons, but it would have looked different. The fact that so many founding fathers were Masons wasn't coincidence. It was because Masonic participation gave them the connections, the organizational skills, and the philosophical framework they needed to turn colonial rebellion into the foundation of a new nation. And here's the really interesting part. After the revolution succeeded, the Masons didn't disappear. They continued to be influential in early American government and society. The first few decades of American history were dominated by Masonic presidents, Masonic Supreme Court justices, Masonic legislators. The infrastructure that helped win the revolution became the infrastructure of the new government. Whether this was good or bad is debatable, but it definitely raises questions about what we mean when we say America was founded on popular sovereignty, when so much of the founding was coordinated by a hierarchical secret society. The Brotherhood under the apron wasn't just a club, it was the organizational backbone of American independence. The question isn't whether Masons were involved in the revolution. They obviously were. The question is whether the revolution was Masonic in character, whether the philosophical principles encoded in American founding documents and symbols reflect Masonic ideology more than popular will. And that's a question that gets uncomfortable quickly, because it suggests that American democracy might have been designed by elites who believed in enlightened principles, but not necessarily in direct rule by common people. But that's the pattern we keep seeing. American history is more complicated than the myths we tell. The revolution wasn't just patriots versus tyrants. It was smugglers protecting profits, Masons implementing philosophy, and ordinary people getting swept up in something much bigger than they understood. All of these things are true simultaneously. The Masonic machine of independence was real, and it shaped America in ways we're still living with today. Now, if you thought smugglers starting a revolution was wild, buckle up, because we're about to talk about the time the father of the nation might have had a supernatural experience that predicted America's future, or didn't. Depending on who you ask and how comfortable you are with the idea that the most famous president in American history might have been visited by an angel. Either way, the story's absolutely bonkers, and the timing is suspicious enough to make you wonder. Winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. If you're picturing a cozy winter retreat with hot chocolate and snowball fights, let me stop you right there. Valley Forge was basically hell frozen over. The Continental Army had just lost Philadelphia to the British, which was humiliating enough on its own, and now George Washington and about 12,000 soldiers were camped in the Pennsylvania wilderness during one of the coldest winters on record. No proper shelter, no adequate supplies, and definitely no hot chocolate. The conditions were so bad that they make modern camping look like a luxury resort experience. These men were living in crude log huts that they had to build themselves, and I'm using the term huts generously here. We're talking about structures that would fail a building inspection in every possible way. Dirt floors, gaps in the walls where the wind screamed through, roofs that leaked, and zero insulation. The modern equivalent would be trying to survive a Pennsylvania winter in a garden shed, except the garden shed probably has better structural integrity. Food situation, catastrophic. The army was on starvation rations, and sometimes not even that. Soldiers were eating fire cake, which is exactly what it sounds like. Flour and water mixed together and cooked over a fire. No salt, no flavour, no nutritional value beyond barely keeping you alive. It's like if you took the blandest, saddest cracker you can imagine and then made it worse. Some days they didn't even have that. There are documented instances of soldiers going days without food, surviving on basically nothing while watching their commanders somehow maintain access to slightly better rations, which definitely did wonders for morale. Disease was ripping through the camp like a particularly enthusiastic plague. Typhoid, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox, basically every illness you could catch in unsanitary, overcrowded, freezing conditions decided to have a party at Valley Forge. And the medical care available was, let's say, not exactly cutting edge. The best treatment available was often, hope you don't die, followed by, well, you died, better dig another grave. Roughly 2,000 soldiers died that winter without the British firing a single shot. That's a 20% casualty rate from just existing in these conditions. Clothing was a nightmare. Soldiers didn't have proper winter gear. Many didn't have shoes. There's the famous image of bloody footprints in the snow at Valley Forge, and that's not poetic exaggeration. That actually happened. Men were wrapping their feet in rags and leaving trails of blood as they walked because they had no other option. Uniforms were falling apart and there was no system in place to replace them. Some soldiers were wearing literal blankets as clothing. Not exactly the professional military image you want when you're trying to convince people you can defeat the British Empire. So morale was, unsurprisingly, in the toilet. Desertions were happening constantly. Why wouldn't they? You're freezing, starving, diseased and unpaid, watching your friends die of dysentery in a leaky hut while the war seems to be going increasingly badly. The British are comfortably settled in Philadelphia, probably enjoying actual food and heated buildings, while you're eating fire cake and wondering if your toes are going to fall off from frostbite. The temptation to just walk away and go home must have been overwhelming, and Washington himself not having a great time. The commander-in-chief was under enormous pressure from basically every direction. Congress was criticizing his leadership. There was a whole conspiracy happening behind his back to replace him with General Horatio Gates. Supplies weren't arriving, money wasn't arriving, reinforcements weren't arriving, and his army was literally dying around him. If there was ever a moment where giving up might have seemed reasonable, this was it. This is the context we need to understand before we get into the weird mystical part. Valley Forge was the absolute lowest point of the Revolutionary War. If the Continental Army had collapsed here, the war would have been over, independence would have failed, and we'd all be drinking tea and spelling colour with a U right now. The entire future of America was balanced on a knife's edge in this frozen hellscape, and it genuinely looked like the knife was about to fall the wrong way. And then, allegedly, something happened. The story goes that during this desperate winter, Washington had a vision. The details vary depending on which version you read, because this story has been told and retold and embellished so many times that nailing down the original version is basically impossible. But the core narrative is this. Washington was in his quarters, either praying or meditating or just trying to figure out how to keep his army from completely dissolving, when he experienced something supernatural. Some versions say an angel appeared to him, others describe it as a vision or a prophetic dream. The apparition supposedly showed him the future of America, the expansion westward, the nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the trials and conflicts ahead. Some accounts claim the vision showed him three great perils that America would face: the Revolutionary War itself, a great civil war to come, and a final conflict with foreign powers. It's all very dramatic and biblical sounding, which should immediately make your skepticism radar start pinging. The most famous version of this story comes from an account published in 1859. That's right, nearly a century after Valley Forge, in a newspaper called the National Tribune. It was supposedly a first-hand account from a guy named Anthony Sherman, who claimed to have been at Valley Forge and heard the story directly from Washington. The problem? Sherman's military service is questionable. There's no contemporary documentation of this story, and it conveniently appeared right before the Civil War, when people were desperate for reassurance that America had divine destiny on its side. Skeptics, reasonably, point out that this has all the hallmarks of a myth created after the fact. Washington himself never mentioned having any such vision in his extensive writings and letters. The man wrote constantly and documented basically everything, but somehow forgot to mention the time an angel showed up and revealed America's future. That seems unlikely. Plus, the story appeared at a politically convenient time and included suspiciously specific predictions about events that had already happened by the time it was published. It's the historical equivalent of someone claiming they predicted a football game's score after the game is over. But here's where it gets interesting, and why this story persists despite the very legitimate skepticism. About 10 days after the army left Valley Forge in June 1778, something genuinely remarkable happened at the Battle of Monmouth. Washington's army, which had been on the brink of collapse just months earlier, fought the British to essentially a draw, and by some accounts actually won. This was the same army that had been freezing and starving and dying of disease, and suddenly they were matching the professional British forces in open combat. What changed? Well, a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben had arrived at Valley Forge in February and spent the winter drilling the Continental Army into an actual fighting force. He taught them proper military formations, improved their tactics, and basically turned a mob of freezing farmers into something resembling a real army. So there's a perfectly rational explanation for the transformation: professional military training. But the timing is just dramatic enough that it's easy to see why people wanted to believe something supernatural had intervened. The prayer story, separate from the vision but often conflated with it, claims that a Quaker farmer named Isaac Potts stumbled upon Washington praying fervently in a grove of trees, on his knees in the snow, and was so moved by the sight that he converted from being a British sympathiser to supporting the revolution. Beautiful story, zero contemporary evidence. Potts probably didn't even live near Valley Forge at the time, and the story first appeared decades later, which is becoming a pattern here. So did Washington have a mystical vision at Valley Forge? Almost certainly not in the way the story describes. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests this is a myth that developed later, embellished over time, and served the very specific purpose of making America's founding seem divinely ordained. It's propaganda, basically, but propaganda that worked incredibly well because people wanted to believe it. But, and this is important, the myth itself became historically significant. Whether or not the vision actually happened, the story has influenced American identity and the idea of manifest destiny for over a century. It's been used to justify westward expansion, to provide comfort during crises, and to reinforce the notion that America has some kind of special divine purpose. The fake story had real consequences, which is kind of fascinating when you think about it. And there's something genuinely mysterious about the transformation that did happen at Valley Forge, even without angels. The Continental Army went into that winter broken and came out capable of winning. Washington went in facing potential mutiny and replacement, and came out with his position secured. The cause went from nearly hopeless to viable. Something changed during those terrible months, even if it was just human determination and good training rather than supernatural intervention. Maybe the real mystery isn't whether Washington had a vision, but why the army didn't completely collapse when it had every reason to. These men endured conditions that would break most people, held together through leadership that was often questionable, and somehow came out the other side ready to keep fighting. That's remarkable even without adding angels to the story. Human resilience can look a lot like a miracle when you're standing in the middle of it. The vision story also tells us something about how Americans wanted to see themselves and their nation's founding. The fact that this myth was created and believed so widely suggests a need for America's origins to be not just political or economic, but sacred. The smugglers and the tax protests and the very mundane motivations we talked about earlier. Those don't make for inspiring national mythology. An angel appearing to the father of the country and revealing divine destiny. That's the stuff of legend. Washington himself, whether he had visions or not, definitely understood the power of symbolism and narrative. He carefully cultivated his image, refused to become a king when he easily could have, and set precedents that would define the presidency for centuries. He was acutely aware that he was creating a new kind of nation, and that everything he did would be scrutinized by history. If he had actually experienced something supernatural, would he have kept it secret? Maybe. Or maybe he would have recognized that claiming divine visions is a dangerous game for someone trying to establish a democratic republic rather than a theocracy. The truth is probably boring. Washington was a pragmatic military commander dealing with an impossible situation, who somehow managed to hold his army together through competence, determination, and a fair amount of luck. The arrival of French support, the training from von Steuben, the eventual improvement in supplies, these are rational explanations for why the Continental Army survived and eventually won. But boring truths don't become national myths. Angelic visions do. And in a weird way, the persistence of this story, despite the lack of evidence, is itself revealing about American culture and the need for founding narratives that transcend mere human achievement. We want our heroes to be touched by something greater, our national story to be guided by destiny rather than just the chaotic accumulation of historical accidents. So what really happened at Valley Forge? Men suffered terribly, many died, and those who survived were forged into something stronger by the experience. Washington led them through it without giving up, which given the circumstances is impressive enough without needing supernatural explanations. The army that left Valley Forge was fundamentally different from the one that arrived, transformed by hardship into something capable of winning independence. Did an angel tell Washington this would happen? No. Did Washington have some kind of personal spiritual experience during that dark winter? We'll never know, but probably not. Does it matter? That depends on whether you think the truth of history is more important than the myths we build around it. Both have shaped America, for better and worse, and understanding the difference between them is crucial to understanding how we got here. The vision at Valley Forge is a beautiful story. It's just probably not a true one. But it's the kind of story that a nation tells itself when it needs to believe that suffering has purpose, and that perseverance leads to victory. And in that sense, maybe the vision's truth isn't about whether it happened, but about what it reveals about the people who needed to believe it did. So we've talked about smugglers, masons, and maybe mystical visions. Now let's talk about someone we literally can't talk about in any definitive way because we don't know who they were. Agent 355 is one of the most fascinating mysteries of the American Revolution. A spy whose identity has never been confirmed, whose contributions might have changed the course of the war, and who represents all the people written out of history. Because they operated in the shadows or belonged to groups society didn't bother documenting. Here's what we know for certain. George Washington ran a spy network called the Culper Ring, operating in British-occupied New York from 1778 to 1783. This wasn't amateur stuff. It was a sophisticated intelligence operation with code names, invisible ink, dead drops, and protocols that wouldn't look out of place in a modern espionage thriller. The ring sent Washington crucial information about British troop movements, supply situations, and strategic plans. It was probably the best intelligence network either side ran during the entire war. The Culper Ring used numeric code names to protect identities. George Washington was 711, Samuel Culper Sr. was 722, New York was 727, and somewhere in the documentation, appearing sporadically and mysteriously, is agent number 355. In the Culper code, 355 meant lady, that's it. That's all we know for sure. Somewhere in Washington's spy network was a woman, and she was important enough to be assigned a code number, but not important enough, or too sensitive, for her real name to be preserved in any documents that survived. Now here's where it gets frustrating. We don't even know if 355 was one person, or a code used for multiple female agents. We don't know if she was an active spy, or just a source of information. We don't know how she operated, who recruited her, or what intelligence she provided. We don't know if she survived the war or if she was captured and executed by the British. Everything about Agent 355 is speculation built on the thinnest foundation of actual evidence. But the speculation is fascinating because of what it reveals about the revolution's hidden participants. The most common theory identifies Agent 355 as Anna Strong, a Long Island woman married to a prominent judge. Strong supposedly used her laundry as a signaling system. A black petticoat on the line meant Culper agents needed to make contact, and the number of handkerchiefs indicated which of 6 coves was safe for dead drops. This is brilliant tradecraft if true. Using mundane domestic tasks as cover for espionage is exactly the kind of thing a clever female operative would do, because nobody pays attention to women hanging laundry. But the Anna Strong identification has problems. The evidence connecting her to 355 is circumstantial at best. She was in the right place at the right time and had connections to known Culper Ring members, but there's no direct documentation confirming she was 355. It might be wishful thinking by historians who want to give a name and face to this mystery woman. The other major theory is that 355 was an enslaved woman, possibly named Liss or something similar, who worked in the household of Robert Townsend, one of the key Culper Ring operatives. This theory argues that an enslaved person would have perfect cover for intelligence gathering. Servants were essentially invisible to the white people they served. They could be present during sensitive conversations and no one would think to guard their words. They could move through occupied New York with less suspicion than free white people. And their testimony would be considered worthless in court, so even if caught, they couldn't legally testify against their handlers. The enslaved woman theory is compelling because it addresses one of the big gaps in revolutionary history, the role of black Americans in winning independence. We know tens of thousands of enslaved people escaped to British lines hoping for freedom. We know black soldiers fought on both sides, but the historical record is sparse because enslaved people weren't considered important enough to document thoroughly. If Agent 355 was an enslaved woman risking everything to help win a war that wouldn't even free her, that's both heroic and tragic in ways the standard revolutionary narrative doesn't capture. Some versions of the enslaved woman theory get even more specific, suggesting she may have infiltrated British officer households, possibly through a romantic or sexual relationship, providing intelligence from inside enemy command structure. This would be incredibly dangerous work. If discovered, she'd be executed, and her enslaved status meant she had no protection or legal recourse. If this version is true, Agent 355 paid the ultimate price because, according to some accounts, she was captured by the British, imprisoned on the notorious prison ship Jersey in New York Harbor, and died there, possibly giving birth to a child in captivity before her death. Now, is there solid evidence for any of this? No. The Jersey prison ship theory, the romantic infiltration angle, even the basic identification as an enslaved woman, all of this is speculation based on fragmentary hints and later historians trying to fill in gaps. But the speculation exists because the gaps are real. Women and enslaved people did participate in the revolution, but their stories weren't recorded with the same care as white male soldiers and politicians. So we're left with mysteries like Agent 355, where we know someone was there, doing important work, but we can't say who they were or exactly what they did. Here's what makes Agent 355 particularly significant. Whoever she was, she represents a category of revolutionary heroes we barely acknowledge. The revolution is taught as a story of famous men: Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams. We learn about Paul Revere's ride, the signing of the Declaration, the crossing of the Delaware. We don't learn about the women who ran farms while their husbands fought, who smuggled supplies through enemy lines, who provided safe houses for spies, who nursed the wounded, who gathered intelligence. We especially don't learn about enslaved people who fought for American independence, despite the glaring hypocrisy of slave-owning revolutionaries declaring that all men are created equal. Some enslaved people were promised freedom for their service and actually received it. Many more were promised freedom and betrayed after the war. Their stories are largely lost because they weren't written down, or because the documents were destroyed when they became politically inconvenient. Agent 355, whether she was Anna Strong or an enslaved woman or someone else entirely, stands in for all these invisible participants. She's a symbol of the hidden history of the revolution, all the crucial contributions made by people who weren't important enough to document, who operated in ways that left no paper trail, who did essential work and then were forgotten because official history focuses on battlefields and founding documents, rather than on intelligence gathering and civilian support networks. And here's the thing about espionage: it's inherently difficult to document. Successful spies don't leave records of their activities. The whole point is to operate undetected. So the fact that we know Agent 355 existed at all is remarkable. Most revolutionary spies, especially women and enslaved people, probably left no trace whatsoever. We don't know what we don't know. The speculation about Agent 355 also reveals something about what we want from history. We want to believe that there was a clever woman outwitting the British, or an enslaved person fighting for freedom that would never be extended to her, or a secret hero whose story was suppressed. We want to believe this because it makes the revolution more interesting and more democratic than the standard narrative of elite white men making grand gestures. The truth is probably that the revolution involved thousands of people whose names we'll never know, doing crucial work that historians will never fully document, and Agent 355 is the one we've given a number to because at least we have that much. Some historians argue that the obsession with identifying Agent 355 misses the point. Maybe what matters isn't who she was but what she represents. The recognition that revolutionary victory required more than famous generals and philosophical declarations. It required an entire population mobilized in various ways, including ways that didn't make it into official records. The mystery of Agent 355's identity is less important than the certainty that someone like her existed. But that's intellectually unsatisfying, isn't it? We want names. We want stories. We want to know if the woman who potentially saved the revolution was a wealthy patriot, or an enslaved person seeking freedom or something else entirely. The ambiguity frustrates us because Americans are taught that history is knowable, that the past can be excavated and understood through careful research. Agent 355 reminds us that huge chunks of the past are simply gone, lost when documents burned or when nobody bothered to write things down, or when marginalized people's experiences weren't considered worth preserving. There's also the Benedict Arnold connection. Some theories claim that Agent 355 was instrumental in exposing Arnold's betrayal, his plan to surrender West Point to the British. The evidence for this is thin to non-existent. but it's repeated often enough that it's become part of Agent 355 mythology. If true, it would mean an unnamed woman prevented one of the most potentially catastrophic moments of the Revolutionary War. If false, it's an example of how we project importance onto historical mysteries because we want them to matter. What we can say with confidence is that the Culper ring was real, it was effective, and it included at least one woman coded as 355. Everything else, who she was, what she did specifically, how her story ended, is educated guessing at best. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe having a revolutionary hero whose identity we can't confirm reminds us that history is full of unknown actors whose contributions mattered, but whose names are lost. Agent 355 forces us to confront the limitations of historical knowledge and the biases in what gets recorded. The Revolution's archives preserve the letters of founding fathers and generals. They preserve battle reports and political debates. They don't preserve the experiences of women whose contributions were considered unimportant, or of enslaved people whose humanity was denied, or of spies whose work required invisibility. Agent 355 is the ghost in those archives, present but unknowable, important but unidentifiable. So who was Agent 355? We don't know. We probably never will know, unless some incredibly unlikely document discovery happens. But we know she existed. We know she was part of Washington's intelligence operations. We know she mattered enough to be given a code number, and we know that she represents countless other people whose revolutionary contributions have been forgotten or erased. Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe Agent 355 is more powerful as an unknown symbol than she would be as an identified individual. As long as she remains mysterious, she can represent all the invisible heroes of the Revolution, everyone whose name didn't make it into the history books, but who helped create the nation anyway. That's more valuable than any single identity could be. But if we ever do find out who she was, if some dusty archive yields up her real name and story, that would be extraordinary. It would force a reckoning with how we tell revolutionary history and whose stories we include. It would prove that the official narrative is incomplete, that important actors were written out, that American independence was achieved through more diverse and complicated means than we generally acknowledge. Until then, Agent 355 remains what she's been for over 2 centuries, a number in a code, a mystery in the archives, a reminder that American history is full of stories we'll never fully know. And maybe that's the most American thing about her. A nation founded on revolutionary ideals but unable or unwilling to preserve the stories of everyone who fought for those ideals. That contradiction is as foundational as any document or monument. Speaking of myths we tell ourselves about the Founding Fathers, let's talk about one of the most famous deaths in American history, the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. You know the story. It's been turned into a wildly successful musical, countless books, and basically every history class in America. Hamilton, the brilliant founding father, the financial genius, the noble statesman, gets murdered by the villainous Aaron Burr in a senseless duel in 1804. Hamilton throws away his shot, taking the moral high ground, and Burr kills him anyway like the sneering bad guy he obviously was. Beautiful, tragic, clear-cut morality tale. Except here's the problem. In 1976, the Smithsonian Institution examined the actual dueling pistols used in that famous confrontation, and they found something that completely changes the story. Hidden inside Hamilton's pistols was a secret mechanism, a hair trigger that would let the shooter fire significantly faster than their opponent. And suddenly, the whole narrative of noble Hamilton versus wicked Burr gets a lot more complicated. Because if Hamilton knew about this mechanism and chose these specific pistols for the duel, then he wasn't planning to throw away his shot at all. He was planning to cheat. Let's back up and set the scene properly, because the Hamilton-Burr rivalry was building for years before they finally met on that dueling ground in Weehawken, New Jersey. These two men had been circling each other like sharks for decades. Hamilton, born illegitimate in the Caribbean, had basically willed himself into American history through sheer brilliance and relentless ambition. He'd been Washington's aide during the Revolution, written most of the Federalist Papers, and essentially created America's entire financial system as the first Secretary of the Treasury. The man was accomplished, no question. Burr, meanwhile, was also accomplished, but in a much less flashy way. He'd served in the Revolution, been a senator, and eventually became vice president under Thomas Jefferson. He was smart, politically savvy, and by most accounts pretty good at his job. But Hamilton absolutely hated him, and that hatred was personal, vicious, and publicly expressed at every possible opportunity. Hamilton spent years sabotaging Burr's career. When Burr ran for president in 1800, Hamilton campaigned against him so viciously that Burr ended up as vice president instead, losing to Jefferson. When Burr then tried to run for governor of New York in 1804, Hamilton again publicly destroyed his candidacy with relentless personal attacks. We're not talking about policy disagreements here. Hamilton was spreading rumours, questioning Burr's character, and basically treating political opposition like a personal vendetta, which it probably was. The final straw came when Hamilton supposedly called Burr despicable at a dinner party, and someone published it in a newspaper. Burr demanded an explanation or an apology. Hamilton refused to provide either, basically saying the equivalent of "I said what I said." So Burr challenged him to a duel, because this is how gentlemen of the early 1800s handled their problems, not with lawyers or mediation, but with pistols at dawn. Very mature, very rational. Now here's what we've been taught about what happened next. On July 11th, 1804, Hamilton and Burr met at a dueling ground in Weehawken, which was across the river from New York because dueling was illegal in New York, but apparently New Jersey was fine with it, or at least looked the other way. The traditional story says Hamilton had moral objections to dueling, had actually opposed it publicly, and went into this duel planning to deliberately miss Burr to prove a point about the barbarism of the practice. According to the sanitized version, Hamilton fired first but aimed high, purposely missing Burr and putting his own life in danger to take the moral high ground. Burr, the villain, then shot Hamilton anyway, mortally wounding him. Hamilton died the next day after suffering horribly, and Burr became the most hated man in America, his political career destroyed, his reputation ruined forever. Hamilton died a martyr to his principles. Burr lived as a murderer. End of story. Pass the tissues, except the actual evidence paints a very different picture, and it starts with those pistols. The pistols belonged to Hamilton's brother-in-law John Church, and they'd been used in duels before, including one involving Hamilton's own son Philip, who'd been killed in a duel 3 years earlier using these exact same weapons. These weren't just any pistols, they were specifically made for dueling by a London gunsmith, and they were state-of-the-art for the time. Beautiful craftsmanship, perfectly balanced, the 18th century equivalent of custom sporting equipment. But when Smithsonian researchers examined them in 1976, they discovered something the previous owners probably knew, but history had conveniently forgotten. Inside the pistols was a hidden hair trigger mechanism. When engaged, this mechanism made the trigger pull incredibly light and sensitive, which meant the shooter could fire much faster than someone using a normal trigger. It's like having a cheat code in a video game, except the stakes are actual human lives instead of high scores. Here's how it worked. The mechanism could be secretly set before the duel by pushing a small lever inside the pistol. To anyone looking at the gun, it would appear completely normal. But the person firing it would have a massive advantage. They could shoot perhaps a full second faster than their opponent, which in a duel is basically an eternity. 1 second is the difference between living and dying. Now the crucial question, did Hamilton know about this mechanism? The pistols belonged to his family. His son had used them. He specifically chose these pistols for this duel. And the Smithsonian found evidence that the hair trigger had been engaged during the Hamilton-Burr duel. So either Hamilton knew and was planning to use this advantage, or he didn't know and someone else set it without telling him, which seems unlikely given that these were his family's pistols. If Hamilton knew, and the evidence suggests he probably did, then the entire story changes. He wasn't planning to throw away his shot. He was planning to shoot first and shoot fast, using a mechanical advantage his opponent didn't know existed. The noble martyr story? Propaganda. The reality? Hamilton tried to cheat and it backfired spectacularly. Here's what probably actually happened. Hamilton fired first, but he missed. Not because he was aiming high on purpose. He fired early because of the hair trigger before he'd properly aimed and the shot went wild. Burr, hearing Hamilton's gun go off and presumably thinking he'd just been shot at with intent to kill, returned fire and hit Hamilton in the abdomen. Hamilton's wound was mortal. He died the next day, and Burr's life was effectively over too, just in a different way. The aftermath was immediate and brutal for Burr. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though the charges were eventually dropped. But his political career was finished. He completed his term as vice president, because apparently you can be wanted for murder and still hold federal office, which is a fun constitutional quirk, but he was radioactive politically. His own party abandoned him, his reputation was destroyed, and he spent the rest of his life as basically the most hated man in American history, until Benedict Arnold came along and gave him some competition for the title. Meanwhile, Hamilton became a martyr. His funeral was enormous. He was mourned as a fallen hero, his financial policies became enshrined, and the story of his death was carefully shaped into a narrative that fit the myth better than the messy reality. The duel became a morality tale about the evils of dueling, with Hamilton as the victim of barbaric practice rather than an active participant who brought rigged equipment to a gunfight. And here's the thing, this sanitization of history wasn't accidental. Hamilton's family and political allies had every reason to present his death in the most favourable light possible. Admitting that he'd tried to cheat in a duel and accidentally killed himself would have been embarrassing and would have undermined his legacy. Much better to paint him as a reluctant participant who took the moral high ground and was murdered by a vindictive villain. The rigged pistol story also raises questions about Hamilton's son Philip, who'd been killed in a duel with these same pistols in 1801. Philip was 19, and he'd challenged a lawyer named George Eaker after Eaker gave a speech criticising Alexander Hamilton. The duel followed a similar pattern. Philip supposedly planned to withhold his fire to prove a point. Eaker shot him. Philip died. Tragic loss of a young life because of his father's political feuds. But if these pistols had a secret advantage, did Philip know about it? Did he try to use it and fail just like his father would 3 years later? Or did the Hamilton family create the withholding fire story for Philip too, establishing a pattern that they'd repeat after Alexander's death? We'll never know for sure, but the parallels are suspicious. What we do know is that the Hamilton family kept using these pistols for duels despite knowing they'd killed Philip. That's either incredibly morbid or suggests the family valued the mechanical advantage enough to overlook the tragic associations. Neither option looks great. The broader lesson here is about how historical narratives get constructed and who gets to control them. Hamilton won the propaganda war even while losing the actual duel. His allies and descendants shaped the story, emphasized certain facts, conveniently forgot others, and turned a messy, morally ambiguous event into a clear tale of good versus evil. And for almost 2 centuries, that's the story everyone believed. Burr, meanwhile, got written as the villain and had almost no one defending his version of events. He lived for another 32 years after the duel, dying in 1836, and spent most of that time in varying degrees of exile and infamy. He tried to rebuild his life, failed, got involved in some extremely sketchy Western expansion schemes that might have been treasonous, got arrested for that, was acquitted but never recovered his reputation. The man who killed Hamilton became the man who almost destroyed himself through that one act. And here's the tragic irony. Burr was probably in the right to challenge Hamilton to the duel by the standards of the time. Hamilton had been publicly trashing his reputation for years. By 18th century gentleman's honour code, demanding satisfaction through a duel was the appropriate response to repeated public insults. Burr followed the rules. He demanded an explanation, didn't get one, issued a challenge, showed up, and defended himself when shot at. He did everything correctly according to the social norms of his era. But history doesn't care about following the rules. It cares about who writes the story afterward, and Hamilton's people wrote a much better story than Burr's people, assuming Burr even had people left by that point. The discovery of the hair trigger in 1976 should have fundamentally changed how we understand this duel, but it largely hasn't. The traditional narrative is too entrenched, too useful, too dramatically satisfying. We want Hamilton to be the noble victim. We want Burr to be the villain. The truth, that both men were flawed, that Hamilton possibly tried to cheat, that Burr was defending himself against what he reasonably believed was a lethal attack, is too complicated for a simple morality tale. This is the pattern throughout American history. We simplify, we mythologize, we turn complex people into two-dimensional characters that fit our preferred narratives. The smugglers become pure patriots. The mystical visions become historical fact. The duelist with rigged pistols becomes a martyred saint, and the historical record gets buried under layers of propaganda and wishful thinking. So what's the truth about Hamilton's death? He challenged a man who had legitimate grievances against him, brought pistols with a secret advantage to the duel, fired first but missed because the hair trigger made him shoot before he was ready, and got killed in return by someone who thought he'd just been shot at with intent to kill. Not murder, not martyrdom, just a stupid preventable tragedy caused by pride, anger, and mechanical failure. And we've been lying about it for over 200 years because the truth makes nobody look good and doesn't serve anyone's political purposes. The real mystery isn't what happened in that duel. We actually know that pretty well now. The real mystery is why we're so attached to the false version that we can't let it go, even when the evidence is literally sitting in the Smithsonian with a sign saying, "Hey, this is a cheating device." American history is full of these moments where the myth and the reality diverge and we collectively decide to stick with the myth because it's more comfortable. But every time we do that, we lose something important, the ability to see our founders and our history as they actually were, not as we wish they'd been. Hamilton wasn't a saint. Burr wasn't a devil. They were just men, flawed and complicated, who made terrible decisions that ended in tragedy. And if we can't be honest about something as documented and studied as the Hamilton-Burr duel, what else are we getting wrong? What other convenient narratives have we accepted without questioning? That's the real lesson here. Not that Hamilton might have been a cheater, but that our entire understanding of American history might be built on these kinds of calculated distortions, piled up over centuries until the truth is barely visible beneath. The myths. If you thought the myths and secrets we've covered so far were wild, wait until you see what the Founding Fathers literally built into the ground of America's capital city. Because Washington, D.C. isn't just a city. It's a massive geometric puzzle filled with Masonic symbols that you can literally see from space if you know where to look. We're talking about compasses, squares, pentagrams, and mysterious boundary markers that were installed using secret rituals. The entire city is basically one giant coded message, and we've been walking on it for over 2 centuries without fully understanding what it says. Let's start with the most obvious weirdness. Washington, D.C. is one of the only major cities in the world that was completely designed from scratch, according to a single master plan. Most cities just kind of happen over time. They start as a trading post or a fort, people build houses near it, roads develop organically based on where people need to go, and eventually you've got a city that makes no rational sense because it was built by accident over centuries. Looking at you, Boston, with your streets that appear to have been designed by a drunk colonial goat. But Washington, D.C.? Nope. In 1791, George Washington and Congress decided they needed a capital city that wasn't in any existing state, because having the federal government based in one state was causing political drama. So they carved out a perfect diamond shape, 10 miles on each side from Maryland and Virginia, right on the Potomac River. And then they hired a French engineer named Pierre L'Enfant to design the entire city from nothing, which is either incredibly ambitious or incredibly arrogant depending on how you look at it. L'Enfant's plan was wild. He designed a city based on grand European capitals, with wide boulevards radiating out from important buildings like spokes on a wheel. He overlaid this radial pattern on top of a traditional grid system, creating these diagonal avenues that cut across the normal street grid at weird angles. If you've ever tried to navigate DC as a tourist, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Nothing makes sense, every intersection is a nightmare, and you end up at Thomas Circle when you were trying to get to DuPont Circle because apparently geometry is a suggestion in this city. But here's the thing, L'Enfant wasn't just being artistic or deliberately confusing future visitors. Those diagonal avenues and the specific way they intersect create patterns, specific patterns, Masonic patterns. And the Founding Fathers who approved this design absolutely knew what they were doing. Before we get into the symbols themselves, let's talk about those boundary stones, because this is where things get properly weird. When they surveyed the original boundaries of the District of Columbia in 1791, they didn't just pound stakes into the ground and call it a day. They installed 40 boundary stones, placed exactly 1 mile apart, marking the perfect diamond shape of the original district. And these weren't ordinary survey markers. They were set in place using Masonic ceremonies. The ceremonies involved all the classic Masonic ritual stuff: corn, wine, and oil poured on the stones while men in aprons performed specific rites. This is documented historical fact, not conspiracy theory. The Masons were openly involved in consecrating the boundaries of America's capital city using their religious ceremonies. Imagine if today we decided to mark the boundaries of a new federal district using Scientology rituals, and you get a sense of how weird this actually was, except nobody questioned it at the time because half the founding fathers were Masons anyway. These boundary stones are still out there, by the way. Most of them are still standing after more than 230 years, scattered around DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Some are in parks, some are in people's backyards, one is in a parking lot. They're these small sandstone blocks with jurisdiction of the United States carved on one side and the year and mile marker on the other. You can go find them if you're into that sort of thing, though I should warn you that hunting for 18th century survey markers in suburban neighbourhoods does make you look slightly unhinged to the locals. Now let's talk about the street layout and the symbols people claim to see in it. The big one is the pentagram. If you look at a map of DC and draw lines connecting certain street intersections north of the White House, you can create a nearly perfect 5-pointed star with its tip pointing down. The points of this pentagram are formed by the intersections of diagonal avenues, Massachusetts and Connecticut, Vermont and K Street, Rhode Island and P Street. The centre of the pentagram falls right around Logan Circle. Is this intentional? Well, here's the thing. Pentagrams have been symbols in Western mysticism for thousands of years, and Masons absolutely used them. The 5 points represented various philosophical concepts depending on who you ask. The downward-pointing pentagram specifically has been associated with both Masonic symbolism and, unfortunately for anyone trying to defend this as totally innocent, some darker occult traditions. Whether the founders intended this, or whether it's just an artifact of geometric street design, is something people love to argue about on the internet at 3 a.m. Then there's the compass and square, the most recognizable Masonic symbol. The compass is the tool used to draw circles, the square is the tool used to create right angles, and together they represent divine creation and human morality, or something like that depending on which Masonic text you read. And allegedly, if you look at the street layout around the Capitol building, you can see these shapes. The compass formed by certain avenues, the square by others, all centered on the building where Congress meets. The letter G, which in Masonic symbolism stands for either God, geometry, or the great architect of the universe depending on who you ask, supposedly appears multiple times in the street layout as well. Some people claim you can see it formed by the streets around the White House, others find it in different configurations. Honestly, once you start looking for letters in a complex street grid, you can probably find the entire alphabet if you try hard enough, so take this one with a grain of salt the size of the Washington Monument. Speaking of the Washington Monument, let's talk about that thing because it's basically a giant Egyptian obelisk sitting in the middle of America's capital, which is already weird enough without adding layers of Masonic meaning. The monument is 555 feet tall, weighs over 90,000 tons, and is the world's tallest stone structure. It's also shaped like an ancient Egyptian monument to the sun god Ra, which seems like an odd choice for honouring the first president of a Christian nation, but here we are. The cornerstone of the Washington Monument was laid on July 4th, 1848, Independence Day, naturally, in a massive Masonic ceremony. The ceremony was conducted by the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of the District of Columbia, using the same trowel that George Washington himself had used to lay the cornerstone of the Capitol building in 1793. They weren't exactly being subtle about the Masonic connections. And if you manage to get to the very top of the monument, which you can't anymore because it's been closed for repairs more often than it's been open in recent years, you'll find a small aluminum capstone with the Latin phrase Laus Deo inscribed on it. That means praise be to God, and it faces east toward the rising sun. Egyptian solar worship vibes? In my American monument? It's more likely than you think. The deeper you dig into DC's architecture and layout, the more Masonic symbolism you find. The House of the Temple, headquarters of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, sits on 16th Street and is literally designed to look like an ancient temple, complete with massive columns and sphinx statues. Because nothing says we're a normal American organization quite like building a replica of ancient mystery cult architecture in the nation's capital. The Capitol building itself is loaded with symbolism. The dome is topped with the Statue of Freedom, which faces east. The crypt beneath the dome, yes, there's a crypt in the Capitol, was originally designed to hold George Washington's body, like he was some kind of American pharaoh. Washington's family refused to let this happen, which is probably the only reason we don't have mummified presidents on display, but the crypt is still there, empty except for tourist groups and the crushing weight of historical weirdness. And then there's the apotheosis of Washington, the fresco painted on the dome's interior. Apotheosis means the elevation of someone to divine status, and that's literally what the painting depicts. George Washington ascending to heaven surrounded by angels and classical deities. He's painted as a god sitting in the clouds being worshipped. In a country that was supposedly founded on rejecting monarchs and divine right of kings, we painted our first president as a literal deity on the ceiling of our most important government building. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Now here's where we need to separate verified historical fact from speculation and conspiracy theory, because this topic attracts conspiracy theorists like the Washington Monument attracts lightning strikes. Yes, many founding fathers were Masons. Yes, Masonic ceremonies were used to consecrate important buildings and boundaries. Yes, the city layout includes geometric patterns that can be interpreted as Masonic symbols. These are facts. What's speculation is the idea that all of this was part of some grand conspiracy to encode secret messages or to channel occult power or to prepare for the arrival of ancient aliens or whatever else people want to claim. The more likely explanation is that the Masons were simply using their standard symbolic vocabulary in the design of the city because that's what they knew and valued. It's like how medieval Christians put crosses and biblical scenes on everything, not because they were part of a conspiracy, but because that was their cultural framework. The Masons of the 18th century saw geometry as sacred. They believed in the great architect of the universe who created reality according to mathematical principles. So when they designed a city, they naturally incorporated geometric patterns they considered meaningful and harmonious. It wasn't necessarily sinister. It was just how they thought about design and order. That said, it's undeniable that they were being deliberately symbolic. You don't use Masonic rituals to consecrate boundary stones by accident. You don't design a street layout that happens to form pentagrams and compasses purely by chance. The founding fathers knew exactly what they were doing. They were encoding their beliefs and values into the physical structure of the capital, creating a city that would silently broadcast their philosophical worldview to anyone who knew how to read it. What's fascinating is how open they were about it. This wasn't hidden or secret in the way we think of secrets today. The Masonic ceremonies were public events. The symbolism was visible to anyone who looked. They weren't trying to conceal it. They were proud of it. In their minds, they were building a new kind of nation based on Enlightenment principles, reason, and sacred geometry, and they wanted the capital to reflect that. But over time, as Masonry became more controversial and conspiracy theories proliferated, people started looking at DC's design with suspicion instead of admiration. The same symbols that the founders put there openly became evidence of sinister plots in the minds of later generations. The context shifted, even though the stones and streets stayed the same. The real mystery isn't whether the symbols are there, they obviously are. The real mystery is what the founders intended them to mean, and whether that meaning has been lost or distorted over time. Were they creating a city aligned with cosmic principles? Were they just showing off their club affiliation on a massive scale? Were they encoding philosophical teachings for future generations to discover? All of the above? None of the above? We'll probably never know for certain because the people who designed the city are long dead, and they didn't exactly leave behind a "here's what all the symbols mean" guidebook. We have their actions, their buildings, their street layouts, and their documented Masonic affiliations. We can make educated guesses about their intentions based on Masonic teachings and Enlightenment philosophy. But definitive answers? Those are as elusive as the cornerstone of the White House, which we'll get to in the next chapter. What we can say is that Washington, D.C. is unique among world capitals in being entirely designed rather than evolved, and that design incorporates an extraordinary amount of symbolic geometric patterns associated with Freemasonry. Whether you think that's fascinating historical context, proof of occult influence, or just 18th century architects being extra, the fact remains that you literally cannot walk through downtown DC without stepping on or past multiple Masonic symbols, encoded in the city's layout. The founders built their beliefs into the ground itself, creating a capital city that's as much a philosophical statement as it is a place for government. They transformed abstract Masonic ideals about geometry, harmony, and divine architecture into actual streets, buildings, and monuments. And they did it so skillfully that most people can walk around DC their entire lives without noticing that they're living inside a giant Masonic diagram. That's either the most ambitious public art project in history or the world's least secret society headquarters, depending on your perspective. Either way, it's wild that this isn't taught in every American history class, because understanding that America's capital was deliberately designed using sacred geometry and Masonic symbolism is pretty crucial context for understanding the founders. Actual worldview versus the sanitized version we usually get. So next time you're in Washington, D.C. trying to figure out why the streets make no sense and why everything is covered in classical symbolism and Egyptian imagery, remember, it's not poor urban planning, it's sacred geometry. The founding fathers weren't just building a capital, they were building a temple, a geometric manifestation of Enlightenment philosophy and Masonic ideals, preserved in stone and street layout for as long as the Republic endures. And that raises an interesting question that nobody really wants to answer. If our capital city is built as a Masonic temple, what does that say about the relationship between Freemasonry and American government? Is it just historical artifact, or is there something deeper going on? We'll leave that question hanging as we move forward, because honestly, the answer might be more complicated than either the conspiracists or the debunkers want to admit. So we've established that Washington, D.C. is basically a giant Masonic symbol disguised as a capital city. Now let's talk about one of the strangest mysteries in American architecture. The cornerstone of the White House, which was ceremonially placed with great fanfare in 1792 and then promptly vanished into thin air. We're talking about a massive stone that was buried with a time capsule containing potentially crucial historical documents, and despite multiple renovations, reconstructions, and even complete gutting of the building, nobody has been able to find it. It's like losing your car keys, except the keys are a several £100 stone block and the car is the most famous residence in America. Let me set the scene. October 13th, 1792. The White House isn't called the White House yet. It's just the President's House, because apparently creativity in naming wasn't a strong suit of the early Republic. The building is barely started, just foundations and the beginning of walls, and the Freemasons are about to perform one of their signature ceremonies to lay the cornerstone. This is a big deal, huge deal. The kind of ceremony you don't do for just any building. The ceremony follows the traditional Masonic ritual for cornerstone laying, which involves corn, wine, and oil. Not exactly the construction materials you'd expect, but these aren't practical offerings, they're symbolic. The corn represents plenty, the wine represents joy and cheerfulness, and the oil represents peace and harmony. Very poetic, very mysterious. Very much the kind of thing that makes conspiracy theorists extremely excited. The Masons who performed this ceremony weren't random members either. These were high-ranking Masons, possibly including members of the Georgetown Lodge, and the ceremony was conducted according to strict ritual protocols that had been passed down for generations. They weren't just slapping a stone down and calling it a day. They were consecrating this building as something sacred, embedding their philosophical and spiritual values into its literal foundation. And here's where it gets really interesting. Inside that cornerstone they placed a time capsule. What was in it? Great question. We don't know, because, and I cannot stress this enough, we cannot find the cornerstone. It's gone, vanished, missing. The most important foundational stone of one of America's most important buildings has pulled a disappearing act that would make Harry Houdini jealous. Now, you might be thinking, how hard can it be to find a cornerstone? It's literally in the corner of the building. The word corner is right there in the name. And you'd think that, wouldn't you? Except architecture doesn't work that way. Cornerstones aren't always placed in the actual physical corner of a building. Sometimes they're placed at ceremonially significant locations that have symbolic rather than structural importance. Sometimes they get built over, sometimes they get moved during construction. Sometimes they're placed and then the building plan changes and the stone ends up somewhere completely different from where anyone would logically look. The White House has been searched for this cornerstone multiple times. When they did minor renovations, looked for it. When they did major renovations, looked for it. When they completely gutted the entire interior of the building during the Truman renovation in the 1950s, and I mean completely gutted, they removed everything down to the exterior walls and rebuilt the inside from scratch. They still didn't find it. They had the entire building opened up like a dissected frog in a biology class, and the cornerstone was nowhere to be found. There are several theories about what happened to it. Theory 1, it was placed in a location that's since been built over or modified beyond recognition, and it's still there but inaccessible without literally tearing apart walls we really shouldn't be tearing apart in the President's house. Theory 2, It was removed at some point during one of the many construction phases and either lost, destroyed, or moved somewhere else. Theory 3, and this is where things get spicy. It was deliberately hidden so well that finding it requires specific knowledge that's been lost to time. Now let's talk about what might be in that time capsule, because this is where speculation gets wild. The traditional assumption is that it contains the usual time capsule stuff: newspapers from the day, coins, maybe some documents about the building's construction. Boring but historically valuable. But there's a much more intriguing theory that's been floating around for decades. What if the time capsule contains an alternative version of the Constitution? A document representing the losing side of the constitutional debates, preserved by Masons who wanted to ensure their vision of America's future wasn't completely erased from history. Before you dismiss this as pure conspiracy theory, let's think about the context. The Constitution we have wasn't the first attempt at a governing document. Before 1787, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, which created a much weaker federal government. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, there were massive, heated debates about how much power the federal government should have. Should states be nearly independent? Should there be a strong central authority? Should there even be a president at all? Or would that just recreate the monarchy they'd just fought to escape? The document we ended up with was a compromise. Compromises mean there were people who lost arguments, who wanted different provisions, who had different visions for what America should be. The Federalists wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists wanted to preserve state sovereignty. There were debates about slavery, about representation, about the powers of the presidency. Not everyone was happy with the final result. And here's the thing about the Founding Fathers. They were meticulous record keepers. They wrote everything down. We have countless letters, essays, and documents detailing their debates and disagreements. Is it really so far-fetched to think that someone might have preserved an alternative version of the Constitution, either as a historical record or as a statement of what they believed should have been? The Masons were the perfect group to do this. They had the ritual framework for consecrating important items. They had the secrecy to pull it off without it becoming public knowledge. They had members on multiple sides of the political debates, meaning both Federalists and Anti-Federalists could have agreed to preserve competing visions for posterity. And they had a ceremony happening at the perfect time. The White House cornerstone was laid in 1792, just 5 years after the Constitution was ratified, when all these debates were still fresh and raw. Think about it from their perspective. You've just fought a revolution, created a new nation, and hammered out a governmental structure through brutal political combat. You know that future generations will only see the final product, not all the alternative paths that were considered and rejected. Wouldn't you want to preserve those alternatives somehow? Not to undermine the government, but to ensure that future Americans understood the full range of options that were debated? The counter-argument, of course, is that we have no evidence this happened. None of the surviving Masonic records mention placing an alternative constitution in the White House cornerstone. None of the Founding Fathers wrote about it. There's no smoking gun document saying, hey, we totally hid our version of the Constitution in the White House Foundation. It's speculation based on possibility rather than proof. But, and this is crucial, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about secret societies and time capsules specifically designed to be hidden. If the Masons did place sensitive documents in that cornerstone, they wouldn't exactly advertise it. The whole point of a time capsule is that its contents remain unknown until the capsule is opened. And since we can't find the cornerstone, we can't open the capsule, and we can't know what's in it. The mystery deepens when you consider other Masonic cornerstone ceremonies from the same era. When they laid the cornerstone of the Capitol building in 1793, George Washington himself presided over the ceremony in full Masonic regalia. That ceremony was public, documented, and included placing items in the cornerstone, though what exactly was placed remains somewhat murky because, surprise surprise, that cornerstone is also difficult to locate with certainty. There's a pattern here. The Masons loved ceremonially placing important items in cornerstones of significant buildings, and then those cornerstones became mysteriously hard to find. It's either the world's most consistent streak of bad luck and poor record-keeping, or it's intentional. And given how meticulous the Masons were about everything else, poor record-keeping seems unlikely. The practical problem with finding the White House cornerstone is that the building has been modified so extensively that its original footprint is barely recognizable. There have been additions, excavations for basements and sub-basements, changes to the grounds, and the aforementioned complete interior reconstruction under Truman. The stone could literally be anywhere within or beneath the current structure, or it might have been destroyed during one of these modifications without anyone realizing what they'd destroyed. Modern technology hasn't helped much either. You can't just ground-penetrating radar the entire White House looking for a stone block without causing all sorts of security issues. Plus, the building sits on older foundations, and beneath those are older steel structures and fill dirt and probably the bones of workers who died during construction, because workplace safety wasn't really a thing in the 1790s. Trying to identify one specific stone among all that archaeological complexity is like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach, but let's say we did find it. Let's say tomorrow someone discovers the cornerstone during routine maintenance, and inside is indeed a time capsule. What would an alternative constitution look like? Probably not radically different from what we have. The major frameworks were generally agreed upon. But the differences could be significant. Maybe it would have clearer limits on presidential power. Maybe it would have explicit protections for state sovereignty that were left out of the final version. Maybe it would address slavery more directly instead of dancing around it with euphemisms. Maybe it would include provisions for direct democracy that the founders ultimately rejected. Or maybe it contains something completely different. Maybe it's a Masonic document explaining their philosophical vision for America's future. Maybe it's a record of dissenting opinions from the Constitutional Convention. Maybe it's just a list of who attended the cornerstone ceremony and what they had for lunch that day. We literally cannot know until we find it, and we cannot find it. The frustration of this mystery is that it's solvable in theory but not in practice. The cornerstone exists, or at least existed. It's somewhere, or was somewhere. But the costs and complications of finding it, potentially tearing apart the White House, disrupting its function as the working residence of the president, dealing with security concerns, are prohibitive. So it remains lost and its contents remain unknown, and we're left with speculation and theories. What makes this mystery particularly American is that it combines several of our national obsessions: secret societies, founding fathers, hidden history, and the idea that there might be some secret truth about our nation's origins that changes. Everything if only we could uncover it. It's the historical equivalent of a conspiracy theory, except it's based on real events with real unknowns rather than pure fabrication. The missing cornerstone represents all the lost and hidden parts of American history. All the debates that didn't make it into the official record, all the alternative paths that were considered and rejected, all the compromises where the losing side's position got erased from the narrative. Whether or not there's actually an alternative constitution in that stone, the stone itself symbolizes everything we don't know about our own founding, because the people who knew didn't write it down, or because what they wrote got lost or hidden. So what's really in the White House cornerstone time capsule? An alternative constitution preserved by far-sighted Masons, important Masonic documents, mundane construction records, an empty bottle with a note saying "Gotcha" from some 18th century prankster? We don't know. We probably won't know unless someone gets extremely lucky or extremely determined, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe having mysteries at the heart of our most important institutions reminds us that history is never as simple or as complete as we think it is. The cornerstone is out there somewhere, buried in the foundation of American power, holding secrets we may never uncover. And every president who's lived in the White House has walked over it, unknowingly standing on top of potentially one of the most important historical artifacts in American history. If that's not a perfect metaphor for how we relate to our own history, constantly standing on top of crucial context without realizing it's there, I don't know what is. So we've talked about how Washington, D.C.'s streets are basically a giant Masonic diagram, and how the White House has a missing cornerstone that might contain an alternative constitution. Now let's talk about the Capitol building itself, because this is where things get properly weird in terms of the gap between democratic ideals and pharaoh-level architectural ambitions. We're talking about a building that contains a crypt designed for a president's body, a ceiling fresco that literally depicts him as a god, and symbolism so dense with religious and mystical meaning that you start to wonder if anyone remembered they. We're building a democratic legislature and not a temple to deified rulers. Let's start in the basement, because that's where this gets immediately strange. Beneath the Capitol dome is a crypt, not a storage room, not a basement, a crypt, as in a tomb, a burial chamber. in a building that's supposed to be the seat of Republican government representing the sovereign people. This wasn't some mistake or afterthought. The crypt was deliberately designed and built to house George Washington's body. The plan was to bring his remains from Mount Vernon, entomb them in the Capitol beneath the dome, and create essentially an American pharaoh buried in a massive temple dedicated to the state. Visitors to the Capitol would literally walk above Washington's tomb every time they entered the building. It's the architectural equivalent of making government worship at the altar of the Founding Father, which seems like exactly the kind of monarchical symbolism the Revolution was supposed to reject. Washington's family said no, fortunately. They refused to allow his body to be moved from Mount Vernon, which is probably the only reason we don't have American presidents making pilgrimages to an actual tomb in the Capitol, like it's some kind of secular shrine. But the fact that this was the plan, that architects designed it and Congress approved it, tells you everything about how the founders viewed Washington versus how they claimed to view governmental authority. The crypt still exists. It's down there, empty except for a compass star in the floor marking the exact center point of Washington, D.C.'s 4 quadrants. Tourists can visit it on Capitol tours, and guides will explain its original purpose without really addressing how bizarre it is that America's democratic government almost put a dead president in its basement, like he was Lenin in Red Square. But the crypt is just the foundation, literally and figuratively, for the main event of Washington deification, which is painted directly above it on the dome's interior. The fresco is called The Apotheosis of Washington, painted by Constantino Brumidi in 1865, and it is absolutely bananas if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Apotheosis means the elevation of someone to divine status. Not great leader, not honoured founder, divine God status. And that's exactly what the fresco depicts. George Washington sitting on a throne in the clouds, surrounded by angels and classical gods and goddesses, literally ascending to heaven as a deity. He's wearing purple robes, holding a sword and a book, and radiating divine authority. Around him are liberty and fame, plus personifications of war, science, marine, commerce, mechanics, and agriculture. All the virtues and industries that make America great, organized around the central divine figure of Washington. Let me emphasize this because it's easy to gloss over. The ceiling of the United States Capitol, the building where elected representatives make laws in a democratic republic, features a painting of the first president as a god. Not like a god. As a god. This isn't subtle metaphor or classical allusion. It's explicit deification rendered in fresco, permanently installed in the most important government building in the country. The painting includes actual Greek and Roman deities. Minerva, wisdom, is teaching science. Neptune, the sea, is helping lay the transatlantic cable. Vulcan, crafts, is forging a cannon. These pagan gods are working with American allegorical figures to build the nation, all under the blessing and authority of the divine Washington who sits above them in glory. It's the most flagrant mixing of Christian, classical pagan, and civil religious imagery you could possibly imagine, and it's been staring down at Congress since 1865. And before you think this is just artistic license from an overly enthusiastic painter, remember that this was commissioned by the US government, approved by Congress, and installed in the most symbolically important location in the Capitol dome. This wasn't some rogue artist going off script. This was the official message the government wanted to communicate about Washington and about America's founding. The rest of the Capitol is full of similar symbolism, though slightly less overtly deifying. The rotunda features massive paintings of revolutionary scenes, the signing of the Declaration, the surrender at Yorktown, Washington resigning his commission. These are arranged like stations of the cross in a cathedral, creating a secular pilgrimage circuit through American founding mythology. The statues are all of great Americans in heroic poses. The architecture uses classical Roman and Greek forms to invoke ancient republics. Every design choice is about creating a sense of sacred space and national mythology. The Statue of Freedom that tops the dome is its own weird story. It's a female figure wearing a helmet with an eagle's head and feathers, holding a sheathed sword and a victory wreath. The original design by sculptor Thomas Crawford had her wearing a liberty cap, the traditional symbol of freed slaves in ancient Rome. Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War at the time and would later become President of the Confederacy, demanded the cap be removed because he didn't want any suggestion of emancipation on the Capitol. So Crawford redesigned her with the Native American-inspired feathered helmet instead. There's deep irony here. The statue symbolizing American freedom was modified to remove explicit references to freed slaves by a man who would go on to lead a rebellion to preserve slavery. And the replacement symbolism invokes indigenous American imagery on a building constructed on land taken from indigenous peoples. The layers of contradiction and hypocrisy are almost impressive in their density. The statue faces east toward the sunrise, like the Washington Monument's Laus Deo inscription. This eastern orientation is significant in various mystical traditions. The rising sun represents rebirth, enlightenment, new beginnings. Whether this was conscious symbolic choice or just architectural convention is debatable, but given everything else about DC's symbolism, it seems unlikely to be accident. Inside the Capitol, there's also heavy use of Egyptian and classical symbolism in the columns, decorative elements, and architectural details. Corncob capitals on columns blend American agriculture with classical forms. Tobacco leaves appear in decorative friezes, acknowledging the economic foundation of colonial wealth, though not acknowledging that this wealth came from enslaved labor. The whole building is a monument to American mythology presented through the architectural language of empires, Rome, Greece, Egypt, positioning America as their heir and equal. Now the question becomes, why? Why did the founders and their successors build a government center that looks like a temple to deified leaders when they just fought a war to reject exactly that kind of authority? Why the crypt, the apotheosis fresco, the classical imperial architecture, this sacred space sensibility? Part of the answer is that they wanted America to be taken seriously as a great power. You can't just declare yourself a nation and expect respect. You need monuments, symbols, and architectural gravitas that communicate permanence and importance. Building in classical styles and creating quasi-religious spaces around founding figures was a way to manufacture instant historical legitimacy and gravitas. But there's something deeper and more problematic happening. The founders rejected monarchy and divine right of kings, but they replaced it with something structurally similar, a civil religion with Washington as its central saint or deity figure. Instead of worshipping a king chosen by God, Americans were supposed to revere founding fathers as demigods who created a sacred political order. The authority still flows from exceptional individuals rather than from the collective people, but now the individuals are presented as embodying popular will rather than divine appointment. This creates cognitive dissonance that Americans have never fully resolved. We claim to believe in democratic equality in government by consent of the governed. But we also built literal temples to our leaders, painted them as gods, planned to entomb them in Capitol crypts, and teach children to revere founding fathers as somehow superhuman. These positions are in tension with each other, and the Capitol building embodies that tension in stone and fresco. The deification of Washington specifically serves several purposes. It elevates the founding to sacred status, making criticism of constitutional structures feel like blasphemy. It provides a unifying figure above political disputes. If Washington is a god, his vision for America becomes unchallengeable truth rather than one person's political views. It allows America to have something like a national mythology and founding legend comparable to other nations' origin stories, most of which involve divine or heroic figures. But it also creates problems. If Washington is effectively deified, what does that make his political positions? Reveal truth? If the founding fathers are presented as demigods, how can we criticize the compromises they made on slavery, indigenous rights, and women's suffrage? The religious framing of American founding makes it harder to engage critically with the actual historical figures and their very human flaws and failures. The fact that the apotheosis fresco wasn't painted until 1865, decades after the founding generation died, is telling. This wasn't the founders deifying themselves. It was later Americans creating a mythological founding that served their contemporary political needs. The Civil War had just ended. The nation needed reunification narratives and symbols of permanence. Painting Washington as a god presiding over American virtues was a way to claim that the Union and its values were divinely ordained and eternal. This pattern of creating mythology after the fact appears throughout American history. The sanitization of Hamilton's death, the creation of Washington's vision at Valley Forge, the presentation of the revolution as purely ideological rather than also economically motivated. Each generation reshapes founding mythology to serve current needs, and the Capitol serves as a physical anchor for whichever version of the mythology is currently dominant. The crypt was supposed to anchor Washington's physical body in the center of American power. The fresco anchors his mythological status as divine founder. Together they create a sacred geography where the Capitol becomes a temple, the founding becomes a creation myth, and democratic governance happens under the symbolic oversight of deified leaders. It's brilliant if you want to create national cohesion and shared identity. It's problematic if you want to encourage critical engagement with governance and founding principles. Most Americans walk through the Capitol, look up at the dome fresco and think, "That's cool art," without processing that they're looking at their first president painted as a literal god in the ceiling of their democratic legislature. The cognitive dissonance is so built into American culture that it doesn't even register as weird anymore. Of course we paint our founders as gods while claiming to reject monarchy. Of course we build crypts in government buildings while insisting on democratic equality. Of course we drape Republican government in imperial and religious symbolism while declaring separation of church and state. These contradictions are American identity. The Capitol's secrets aren't really secret. The crypt is on tour routes. The fresco is visible to anyone who visits. But the meaning of these elements, what they say about how America actually views authority versus how we claim to view it, that stays mostly unexamined. We've normalized the deification while continuing to insist on democratic principles, and somehow both things coexist without too much discomfort. Maybe that's the real mystery of the Capitol. Not what's hidden in it, but what's openly visible that we've trained ourselves not to see. The gap between democratic ideals and the quasi-religious worship of founder figures, rendered in architecture and art that would make ancient pharaohs nod in. Appreciation. We built temples to democracy that look and function like temples to deified leaders, and then we act surprised when people treat founding fathers as infallible demigods rather than flawed humans who made consequential decisions. The Capitol tells the truth about American civic religion if you're willing to look at it. We want both democratic equality and exceptional leaders. We want both republican government and founding mythology. We want both rational secular governance and sacred national identity. The building gives us all of that, contradictions included, in one massive architectural statement that's been hiding in plain sight for over 2 centuries. If you thought encoding Masonic symbols into the Capitol's street layout was ambitious, wait until you see what Americans decided to do with their monuments. We're talking about carving presidential faces into sacred mountains, building Egyptian obelisks that secretly worship the sun, and designing skyscrapers as airports for flying balloons. Because apparently when America decides to build something, it's not enough to just build a nice statue or memorial. We have to go absolutely bonkers with hidden meanings, unrealized megalomaniac visions, and enough mystical symbolism to make an ancient pharaoh jealous. Let's start with the most obvious piece of architectural insanity in Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument. This thing is a 555-foot-tall Egyptian obelisk sitting in the heart of America's capital, and nobody seems to find it weird that we honored our first president, who fought against monarchy and royal power, by building him a monument that's literally copied from the architecture of god-kings who ruled as living deities. The cognitive dissonance is spectacular. Obelisks were originally Egyptian monuments dedicated to the sun god Ra. They were symbols of pharaonic power, with their pyramidal tops designed to catch the first rays of sunrise. The ancient Egyptians placed them at temple entrances as connections between Earth and the divine realm. So naturally, when America wanted to honor George Washington, a man who refused to become a king and establish democratic precedent, we built him a monument that screams divine solar worship in architectural language. Makes perfect sense. No contradictions here whatsoever. The construction of the Washington Monument is its own saga of chaos and delays. They started building it in 1848 and didn't finish until 1884. That's 36 years to build what's essentially a big stone pencil. The project ran out of money multiple times, got interrupted by the Civil War, and sat as an embarrassing stump for decades while Congress argued about funding. There's actually a visible line about 150 feet up where the construction stopped and then restarted years later with slightly different coloured marble because they couldn't get the same source anymore. It's like a permanent scar saying we gave up for a while, but here's where it gets mystical. At the very top of the monument on the aluminum capstone, and yes, aluminum was so rare and valuable in the 1880s that using it for the capstone was basically flexing, there's an inscription that says Laus Deo. That's Latin for praise be to God. and this inscription faces east toward the rising sun like an offering to solar deities. Every morning when the sun comes up, the first thing it hits is this phrase praising God, positioned on top of an Egyptian sun worship monument. The layers of religious syncretism here are making my head spin. Inside the monument, specifically in the elevator shaft which tourists ride every day without realizing what they're passing, there's a winged disc symbol. This is a direct reference to ancient Egyptian mythology. The winged sun disk represented the god Horus and divine protection. It's basically hieroglyphic decoration in the elevator of the monument to the father of American democracy. At this point, they weren't even trying to hide the Egyptian obsession. They just went full pharaoh and hoped nobody would ask too many questions. The monument also contains memorial stones embedded in the interior walls, donated by various states, organizations, and even foreign countries. One of these stones came from the Pope, which infuriated anti-Catholic groups so much that they literally stole and destroyed it in 1854. Yes, there was monument heist drama in the 19th century, and it set construction back by decades. The stone was never recovered, so somewhere in the Potomac River or a landfill is a piece of the Vatican that was supposed to be part of America's most iconic monument. Great security work, guys. Now let's talk about Mount Rushmore, because if you thought carving giant faces into a mountain was the extent of the ambition, you have severely underestimated the designer's megalomania. The sculptor, Gutzon Borglum, didn't just want to create a tourist attraction. He wanted to build a secret chamber inside the mountain that would preserve American civilization for thousands of years in case society collapsed. Borglum envisioned what he called the Hall of Records, a room carved deep into the mountain behind the faces, accessed through a hidden entrance containing copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, important historical documents, and records of American achievements. Basically, he wanted to create a time capsule for the apocalypse, like the chamber supposedly hidden under the Sphinx's paws in Egypt, because apparently American monument builders had a serious Egypt complex that they just couldn't shake. The Hall of Records was actually started. Workers blasted a tunnel 70 feet into the mountain behind the heads, but then funding ran out. Borglum died in 1941, and the project was never completed. The tunnel exists, though. It's still there, sealed off from the public, just a dark passageway leading into the mountain with nothing at the end except broken dreams and the echo of what could have been. However, the story doesn't end there. In 1998, almost 60 years after Borglum died, the National Park Service decided to partially fulfill his vision. They placed a repository of records in the unfinished hall. It's not the grand chamber Borglum imagined, but it contains porcelain enamel panels with the text of important American documents, information about the monument's construction, and biographies of the presidents whose faces are carved there. The entrance was then sealed with a 1,200-pound granite capstone, inscribed with a quote from Borglum about the purpose of the monument. So hidden inside Mount Rushmore, unknown to most tourists who visit every year, is a sealed vault containing America's founding documents, accessible only to Park Service personnel and probably destined to be discovered by confused archaeologists. Thousands of years from now, who will assume we were some kind of mountain-worshipping death cult. Which honestly isn't that far off, given that we carved giant heads into a sacred mountain that belonged to the Lakota people. But that's a whole different discussion about cultural appropriation and manifest destiny that we don't have time for right now. The faces themselves required 400 workers and 14 years to complete. They used dynamite to blast away 450,000 tons of rock, which seems like an excessive way to make presidential portraits, but really captures the American spirit of using maximum force for everything. The original plan included carving the presidents down to their waists, showing them seated or standing, but that proved too difficult and expensive. So we got giant floating heads instead, which is arguably creepier and more impressive at the same time. The mountain that became Mount Rushmore was originally called Six Grandfathers by the Lakota, and it was a sacred site in their territory. The United States took it as part of the Black Hills land grab, which violated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, carved white presidents' faces into it, and then named it after a New York lawyer named Charles Rushmore who visited the area once. The irony of creating a monument to American democracy on stolen indigenous land using a name that honors a random lawyer is apparently lost on most people who visit. Now let's shift from mountains to skyscrapers, because the Empire State Building also has its own megalomaniac origin story that nobody talks about. When it was completed in 1931, making it the tallest building in the world at the time, the distinctive spire at the top wasn't just architectural decoration. It was designed to be a mooring mast for dirigibles. That's right, they planned to turn the Empire State Building into an airport for blimps. Picture this in your mind. Giant hydrogen-filled airships floating up to the top of a 1,000-foot building in the middle of Manhattan's unpredictable wind patterns. Passengers disembarking onto a narrow platform 100 stories above the street, in an era before modern safety. Regulations or really any understanding of how terrible this idea was. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, it turns out, everything could go wrong. The plan was attempted exactly once, in September 1931, when a small dirigible managed to moor to the mast for about 3 minutes before dangerous winds forced it to disconnect. The passengers who were supposed to disembark wisely decided that stepping out of a swaying balloon onto a tiny platform in high winds, while 1,000 feet in the air, was maybe not the best idea. The concept was immediately abandoned, and the mooring mast became nothing more than an extremely expensive decoration that occasionally gets hit by lightning. But the ambition to create a skyport in the middle of Manhattan tells you everything about the mindset of 1930s American engineers. They looked at a skyscraper and thought, you know what this needs? The ability to dock flying balloons. Never mind the physics, never mind the safety concerns, never mind the fact that the Hindenburg disaster was only 6 years away and would end the entire dirigible industry. They just went ahead and built it because the future was going to be full of airship commuters, and anybody who said otherwise was a coward. The Empire State Building also has its share of mystical elements, though less obvious than the Washington Monument's Egyptian obsession. The building's Art Deco design incorporates symbols and motifs from various ancient cultures, including ziggurats from Mesopotamia and stylized sunbursts. The lobby features a ceiling mural showing celestial imagery and geometric patterns that would make the Masons proud. Whether this was intentional symbolism or just the aesthetic of the era is debatable, but given everything else we've covered, I'm leaning toward intentional. What ties all these monuments together, the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore, the Empire State Building, and countless others across America, is this pattern of grandiose ambition mixed with mystical undertones and half-realized visions of the future. American monument builders consistently aimed higher, dug deeper, and thought bigger than was practical or sometimes even sane. They wanted to create structures that would last thousands of years, impress distant future civilizations, and encode important meanings for posterity to discover. The Washington Monument was supposed to originally include a massive pantheon at its base, with statues of Revolutionary War heroes and other founding fathers. The pantheon was never built due to cost, so we just got the obelisk standing alone and weird. Mount Rushmore was supposed to have those full-body carvings and the Hall of Records and maybe more presidents, depending on which version of Borglum's vision you look at. The Empire State Building was supposed to be an airship terminal and the gateway to the Sky City future. None of these grand visions were fully realized, but the monuments that resulted are still impressive enough that most people don't realize they're looking at Plan B or Plan C or we ran out of money so this is what you get. There's something very American about this pattern. Dream impossibly big, start with enthusiasm, run into practical and financial limitations, compromise on the vision but still end up with something massive and over the top by anyone else's standards. It's the architectural equivalent of shoot for the moon, and even if you miss, you'll land among the stars, except we're shooting for ancient Egyptian god-king status, and landing at giant stone obelisk that confuses tourists. The mystical. Elements woven into these monuments, the solar worship, the Egyptian symbolism, the hidden chambers, the sacred geometry, reflect a cultural obsession with connecting modern America to ancient civilizations. The founding fathers and the builders who came after them wanted to position America as the heir to Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They wanted their monuments to invoke the same sense of timeless power and divine purpose that ancient monuments conveyed. But here's the irony. Ancient Egyptian obelisks had clear religious meanings understood by everyone in that culture. The pyramids were built with specific theological purposes in mind. When we copy those forms but strip away or remix the original meanings, we end up with monuments that are symbolically confused. Is the Washington Monument honoring a president or worshipping the sun? Is it celebrating democracy or invoking pharaonic power? The answer is somehow both and neither, which is peak American cultural syncretism. Mount Rushmore's Hall of Records idea shows this same impulse to create something eternal that will outlast civilization. Borglum genuinely believed that American society might collapse and that future archaeologists would need to discover the truth about American ideals from his secret mountain vault. He was thinking in terms of thousands of years, imagining a future where Mount Rushmore might be all that remains of American civilization, like the pyramids are now remnants of Egypt. That level of hubris is breathtaking. Imagine being so confident in your monument's importance that you build a time capsule into it for civilizations that don't exist yet. And then imagine being so concerned about the fragility of your civilization that you feel the need to create that time capsule in the first place. Borglum's vision contained both supreme confidence and deep anxiety about America's future, which is honestly very on brand for American culture in general. The unfinished nature of so many of these grand visions also tells us something important. American ambition consistently outpaces American follow-through. We start projects with enormous goals and then have to scale back when reality intervenes. The Washington Monument took 36 years because funding kept running out. Mount Rushmore never got its full bodies or completed Hall of Records. The Empire State Building's airship terminal was used exactly once and then abandoned. These monuments are testimonies to both American ambition and American inability to fully realize that ambition, preserved in stone and steel for future generations to puzzle over. What would these monuments look like if the original visions had been completed? A Washington monument surrounded by a massive pantheon of Founding Father statues would be even more temple-like than it already is. Mount Rushmore with full presidential bodies would be either magnificent or terrifying, depending on your perspective. An Empire State Building actually functioning as an airship port would have been spectacular, right up until the inevitable catastrophic accident that would have killed hundreds. Maybe it's for the best that these visions weren't fully realized. Maybe the compromise versions we ended up with are more honest, monuments to American ambition and limitation, to our desire to touch the eternal and our inevitable falling short, to the gap between what we dream and what we can actually build. They're monuments to the attempt itself rather than the completion, which is oddly appropriate for a nation that's always been more about the journey than the destination. So the next time you visit the Washington Monument, remember you're standing at the base of an Egyptian sun worship structure built for a president who rejected monarchy. When you see Mount Rushmore, remember there's a sealed vault inside containing America's founding documents because the sculptor thought civilization might collapse. When you look at the Empire State Building's spire, remember it was supposed to be a blimp parking lot in the sky. These monuments are weird. They're grandiose. They're full of half-realized megalomaniac visions and mystical symbolism that doesn't quite make sense in context. And they're absolutely perfectly American in their combination of massive ambition, cultural confusion, and the determination to build something huge, regardless of whether it makes any logical sense. That's the real mystery, not what these monuments mean, but what it says about us that we built them this way in the first place. Alright, we've spent several chapters talking about historical mysteries, missing cornerstones, secret societies, deified presidents. Now we're going to take a turn into something completely different but weirdly connected to everything we've been discussing. We're going to talk about Bigfoot, but not just as a cryptozoological curiosity. We're going to talk about why America specifically became obsessed with a hairy forest creature to the point that we've turned it into an industry, a cultural touchstone, and maybe a mirror that reflects something fundamental about the American psyche. First, let's acknowledge that legends of large, hairy, human-like creatures exist basically everywhere humans have lived near forests. The ancient Babylonians had Enkidu, the wild man who lived with animals before being civilized. Himalayan cultures have the Yeti, Australian Aborigines have the Yowie. European folklore is full of wild men and woodwoses. Indigenous peoples across the Americas have various traditions about hairy giants or forest spirits. This isn't uniquely American. It's a near-universal human mythological archetype. So why did Bigfoot become such a specifically American obsession? Why did the United States turn a common folklore element into organized research expeditions, conferences, reality TV shows, an estimated multi-million-dollar tourism industry, and enough consumer products that you can buy Bigfoot beef jerky if you want? There's something about American culture that latched onto this mystery harder than anywhere else, an understanding that tells us as much about America as it does about Bigfoot. The modern Bigfoot phenomenon really crystallized in the Pacific Northwest in the mid-20th century, though indigenous peoples had been telling stories about Sasquatch for generations before white settlers arrived. The term Sasquatch comes from the Salish word Sesquak, and these weren't just campfire monster stories. For many indigenous groups, these beings were part of their spiritual and natural cosmology. They were real, but not necessarily physical in the way Western science demands. They existed between worlds, neither fully animal nor fully spirit, serving as warnings or guardians or lessons depending on the specific cultural tradition. When white settlers encountered these stories, they did what colonizers typically do. They stripped away the cultural and spiritual context and tried to slot the phenomenon into Western scientific categories. Is it a bear, an ape, a missing link? The reduction of Sasquatch from culturally significant spiritual being to potential zoological specimen is its own kind of colonization, taking indigenous knowledge and repackaging it for Western consumption while ignoring the original framework. The watershed moment for American Bigfoot culture was 1958, when Jerry Crew, a bulldozer operator in Northern California, made plaster casts of large humanoid footprints found at a logging site. The story hit newspapers, the term Bigfoot was coined, and suddenly everyone was paying attention. Then, in 1967, came the Patterson-Gimlin film, that grainy footage of a large hairy biped walking through a forest clearing in Northern California, looking back at the camera before disappearing into the trees. It's been analysed, debated, declared genuine, declared fake, and basically become the most famous piece of alleged cryptid footage in history. Is the Patterson-Gimlin film real? We still don't know. Experts have argued both ways. Defenders point out that the creature's proportions and movement don't match a human in a suit. Critics insist it's obviously a costume. The debate has raged for over 50 years with no resolution, which is perfect for keeping the mystery alive. If it was definitively debunked, the story would die. If it was definitively proven, the mystery would be solved. The uncertainty is what keeps people engaged. What happened after 1967 is what really matters for understanding Bigfoot as cultural phenomenon. America didn't just accept these stories and move on, we industrialized Bigfoot. We created organizations like the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. We started conferences where enthusiasts present papers and evidence. We launched countless expeditions with increasingly sophisticated equipment: thermal cameras, drones, sound analysis, DNA testing. We made it into science, or at least science adjacent, complete with peer review and methodology and databases. And here's what's fascinating. This industrialization of cryptozoology is incredibly American. Only in America would people look at an unexplained mystery and think, we need to approach this with systematic research, proper documentation, and maybe some corporate sponsorship. We've turned Bigfoot hunting into a respectable hobby with equipment lists, best practices, and training courses. You can get certified in Bigfoot research. There are Bigfoot research teams with logos and mission statements. It's professionalized mystery hunting, which is such a weird concept when you step back and think about it. The entertainment industry jumped on this hard. Finding Bigfoot ran on Animal Planet for 9 seasons and over 100 episodes without finding Bigfoot, which is either the greatest failure or greatest success in television depending on how you view it. Countless other shows, documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels have built entire audiences around Bigfoot content. The tourism industry in Pacific Northwest small towns has turned Bigfoot into an economic development strategy. Come visit our forests, maybe see a Sasquatch, buy some themed merchandise. The merchandising is its own phenomenon. You can buy Bigfoot socks, coffee mugs, air fresheners, holiday ornaments, beef jerky, beer, wine, hot sauce. Basically anything you can brand, someone has put Bigfoot on it. There are Bigfoot museums, Bigfoot festivals, Bigfoot marathons. The creature that supposedly represents wildness and mystery has been fully absorbed into consumer capitalism and turned into a cuddly mascot for regional identity. But here's what's interesting about this absorption. It hasn't killed belief in actual Bigfoot. If anything, the commercialization seems to coexist with genuine research and true believers without much conflict. People can buy Bigfoot toilet paper ironically, while also seriously discussing whether recent thermal imaging footage shows real evidence. The symbol and the potentially real creature occupy the same space without negating each other. This gets at something fundamental about American culture, our ability to simultaneously commercialize something and take it seriously. We can turn anything into a product while also maintaining genuine engagement with it. Bigfoot is both a joke and a serious research subject. It's both tourist attraction and potential scientific discovery. These contradictions don't bother Americans the way they might in cultures with more rigid boundaries between serious and frivolous, sacred and commercial. There's also something specifically American about the frontier mythology embedded in Bigfoot culture. America is the country that conquered the wilderness, that pushed westward until there was no more frontier, that mapped and settled and civilized from coast to coast. Bigfoot represents the idea that maybe we didn't conquer everything, that some wildness remains untamed, that the frontier isn't completely closed. It's a comforting myth for a nation built on frontier expansion. There's still mystery out there. We haven't completely domesticated the continent. The locations of Bigfoot sightings are revealing. They cluster in the Pacific Northwest, but they appear everywhere. Florida has the skunk ape, the Midwest has Momo, the South has the Honey Island swamp monster. Every region wants its own version because every region wants to believe it has some remaining mystery, some piece of wilderness that resists complete human control. Bigfoot becomes a way for communities to assert that their forests, their mountains, their swamps still contain something unknown and wild. The demographics of Bigfoot enthusiasts are also interesting. This isn't primarily coastal elites or academics. It's often working-class people, folks in rural communities, people who spend time in forests for work or recreation. These are people who feel connected to wilderness in ways that urban populations don't, and Bigfoot becomes a way to express the knowledge that forests contain things city dwellers don't understand. It's almost a class statement. We know the woods, and we know there's more to them than your scientific rationalism admits. The persistence of Bigfoot belief, despite lack of physical proof, also tells us about American attitudes toward evidence and authority. We're a country that values individual experience over expert consensus. If someone says they saw Bigfoot, no amount of scientific skepticism will convince them otherwise. This radical empiricism, trusting your own eyes over what authorities say is possible, is deeply American. It's the same impulse that drove settlers to reject European hierarchies and trust their own judgment. For better or worse, Americans have a cultural tendency to believe we know better than experts, and Bigfoot is a perfect expression of that. There's also the technological angle. As technology advances, Bigfoot research gets more sophisticated. Trail cameras, satellite mapping, audio analysis software, environmental DNA testing. Modern Bigfoot hunters use tools that would have seemed like science fiction a few decades ago. But the creature still evades capture. This creates an interesting dynamic where advancing technology somehow makes the mystery deeper rather than solving it. The better our tools get, the more we realize we don't know, which is oddly satisfying for believers because it suggests Bigfoot might be more sophisticated or otherworldly than a simple undiscovered ape. The cultural function of Bigfoot extends beyond just entertainment or local tourism. It serves as a focal point for discussions about conservation, wilderness protection, and human relationship with nature. If Bigfoot exists, that's a strong argument for preserving old-growth forests and protecting wildlife habitat. Environmental groups may not officially endorse Bigfoot, but the mythology helps their cause by giving people a reason to care about forest preservation beyond abstract environmental arguments. Bigfoot also functions as American myth in the classical sense, a story that explains something about our relationship to the land and to mystery itself. Ancient cultures had gods and spirits to explain the unknown. Modern rational America isn't supposed to believe in those things, but we still have the human need for mystery and wonder. Bigfoot fills that gap, a mystery that exists outside scientific explanation, that reminds us the world is bigger and stranger than we think, that resists our tendency to explain and categorize everything. The fact that we can't prove Bigfoot exists and can't prove it doesn't exist creates a perfect liminal space where the mystery can flourish. It's unfalsifiable, which makes it intellectually frustrating but culturally productive. As long as the question remains open, Bigfoot can serve whatever function we need. Conservation symbol, tourist attraction, scientific curiosity, spiritual metaphor, embodiment of wilderness, or just entertainment. What makes this particularly American is how we've systematized the uncertainty. We've created organizations, methodologies, and communities around a creature that probably doesn't exist, or exists in ways too strange for normal zoology. We've turned maybe real into an industry and a lifestyle. We've professionalized amateur investigation. We've made Bigfoot into a participatory mystery where anyone can contribute evidence, and anyone's sighting is potentially valid. It's democratic cryptozoology. Everyone gets a voice. Expertise comes from experience rather than credentials, and the truth is determined by community consensus rather than academic authority. The Bigfoot phenomenon also reflects American optimism in a strange way. We believe we can solve this mystery through effort and technology. We believe that persistence will eventually yield proof. We don't accept that some mysteries might be unsolvable or that the creature might not exist. This relentless optimism about our ability to solve problems through application of resources and determination is quintessentially American, even when applied to something as unlikely as finding a giant ape that doesn't want to be found. So what does Bigfoot say about America? It says we need mysteries in a world we've mostly explained. It says we value individual experience over expert authority. It says we can commercialize anything without destroying our ability to also take it seriously. It says we want to believe there's still frontier, still wildness, still unknown territory even though we've mapped every inch of the continent. It says we're willing to invest enormous resources into questions that may not have answers because the pursuit itself is valuable. Bigfoot is American because only America would turn a folklore creature into an organized research field, a tourism economy, a reality TV franchise, and a cultural touchstone while simultaneously maintaining genuine belief that the creature might be real. We've made Bigfoot into everything: monster, mascot, mystery, metaphor, merchandising opportunity, and somehow that hasn't diminished the core appeal of the myth. If anything, the industrialization has spread the mythology further and deeper into American culture. Whether Bigfoot exists as a physical creature is almost beside the point. Bigfoot exists as an American cultural phenomenon, and that existence is real and significant regardless of whether a giant ape is walking around Pacific Northwest forests. We created Bigfoot in our own image, oversized, commercially successful, resistant to explanation, slightly ridiculous, deeply American, and absolutely convinced that mysteries can be solved if we just try hard enough and buy the right equipment. So we've spent the last few chapters talking about verifiable mysteries, monuments we can see, documents we know existed, symbols carved into actual stone. Now we're about to take a hard left turn into territory that makes the Masonic street layouts look downright mundane by comparison. We're talking about Bigfoot, but not the undiscovered primate wandering the Pacific Northwest version that scientists grudgingly admit might possibly exist if we're being generous. No, we're talking about the really weird Bigfoot, the one that glows in the dark, communicates telepathically, shoots mysterious blue beams of light, makes people lose time, and might actually be an interdimensional being rather than just a really hairy ape. Welcome to the deep end of American cryptozoology, where things get so strange that even conspiracy theorists start backing away slowly. The mainstream Bigfoot research community, yes, that's a thing that exists, complete with conferences and peer-reviewed journals which tells you everything about human nature, generally wants to keep things scientific and respectable. They collect footprint casts, analyze hair samples, set up trail cameras, and try very hard to present Bigfoot as simply an unclassified species of great ape that happens to be really good at hiding. It's basically guerrilla research, except the gorilla might not exist. Very reasonable, very materialistic, very much ignoring about 40% of the actual encounter reports, because those reports are too weird to fit the "it's just an ape" narrative. Because here's the problem. A significant chunk of Bigfoot sightings include elements that have absolutely nothing to do with normal animal behavior. We're talking about encounters where witnesses report the creature's eyes glowing red or yellow in ways that don't match typical animal eye shine. We're talking about mysterious lights in the forest, often described as blue or white orbs, appearing in conjunction with Bigfoot activity. We're talking about people experiencing missing time during encounters, waking up hours later with no memory of what happened. We're talking about witnesses claiming the creature communicated with them telepathically, or that they felt a profound sense of being mentally probed during the encounter. Now, before you completely dismiss all of this as people making things up or misidentifying deer while extremely high in the woods, let's acknowledge that these reports come from otherwise credible witnesses who had no reason to add paranormal elements to their stories. In fact, adding weird details like telepathy and glowing lights makes your story less believable, not more. If you wanted people to take you seriously, you'd stick with, "I saw a large hairy biped," and leave out the part about the blue beam that made you black out for 3 hours. The fact that people report these elements anyway, knowing it makes them sound crazy, suggests they're describing something they genuinely experienced, even if we have no idea what that something actually was. let's talk about one of the most famous cases that includes these paranormal elements, the Ape Canyon incident of 1924. A group of miners, led by a guy named Fred Beck, were prospecting for gold in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state when they allegedly had an encounter that would make them flee the area and never return. According to their account, they'd been seeing large humanoid figures watching them from the forest for several days. Then one evening, one of the miners shot at one of these creatures. Bad idea. Terrible idea. Possibly the worst idea anyone has ever had in the history of forest encounters. That night, the creatures, whether Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or angry forest demons, depending on who's telling the story, laid siege to the miners' cabin. And by siege, I mean they spent hours throwing rocks at the cabin, pounding on the walls and trying to break in while the miners huddled inside with their rifles, probably regretting every life decision that led them to that moment. This went on all night. When dawn came, the creatures left, and the miners immediately packed up and abandoned their claim, which tells you how terrified they were because these were gold miners, willing to endure tremendous hardship for the possibility of riches, and they still decided that nothing was worth staying in that valley. Now here's where it gets weird beyond angry Bigfoot attacked us for shooting one of them, which would already be pretty weird. Decades later, Fred Beck published a book about the incident, and his version included details that the original newspaper accounts had left out. According to Beck, the creatures weren't animals at all, they were spiritual beings from another dimension. He claimed they were interdimensional entities that could materialize and dematerialize at will, which would explain why, despite intensive searching, nobody ever found bodies or definitive proof of their existence. Beck described seeing their footprints appear in snow and then suddenly stop in the middle of open ground, as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air mid-step. Beck's dimensional theory gets even stranger. He claimed that the creatures were able to read minds, that they communicated telepathically, and that their attacks on the cabin were less about physical violence and more about psychological warfare. He believed they were testing the miners, probing their minds and ultimately driving them away because humans weren't meant to be in that particular area. Whether Beck came to these conclusions immediately after the incident or developed them over decades of thinking about what happened, we don't know. But his account suggests that something about the encounter felt fundamentally wrong, in a way that couldn't be explained by just big scary animals. The interdimensional Bigfoot theory sounds completely insane until you start noticing how many Bigfoot reports include elements that align with UFO encounter reports. Missing time is a classic UFO abduction element, but it shows up in Bigfoot reports too. Witnesses describe seeing the creature, feeling a sense of disorientation or paralysis, and then realizing hours have passed with no memory of what occurred during that time. It's like the creature comes with a built-in amnesia field, which is not standard equipment for your typical forest-dwelling primate. Then there are the lights. Mysterious lights in the forest where Bigfoot activity is reported are so common that researchers have started documenting them as a separate phenomenon. These aren't flashlights or campfires or easily explained light sources. They're often described as orbs or beams of blue, white, or occasionally red light that move intelligently through the forest, sometimes in conjunction with Bigfoot sightings and sometimes independently. The connection between mystery lights and Bigfoot is strong enough that some researchers now consider light phenomena to be a potential indicator of Bigfoot presence, which is wild when you think about it. We've gone from looking for footprints to looking for unexplained aerial phenomena as a research methodology for finding forest apes. The telepathic communication reports are particularly interesting because they're so specific and consistent across different witnesses who have no connection to each other. People describe hearing a voice in their head, often telling them to leave the area or communicating emotions like curiosity or warning. Some witnesses report feeling overwhelmed by a sense of being mentally scanned or examined, as if the creature was reading their thoughts or intentions. This is not normal animal behavior. Bears don't telepathically tell hikers to get out of their territory. Gorillas don't mentally probe researchers. If these accounts are accurate, we're dealing with something that has cognitive abilities far beyond what we'd expect from an undiscovered primate. And then there are the physical effects that some witnesses report after close encounters, unexplained marks or scratches appearing on their bodies, feelings of being drained of energy, temporary paralysis, intense fear, responses that seem out of proportion to the actual threat level. These symptoms overlap significantly with what UFO contactees report, which has led some researchers down the absolutely bonkers rabbit hole of suggesting that Bigfoot and UFO phenomena might be related, or even the same phenomenon manifesting in different ways. The theory goes something like this. What if Bigfoot isn't a physical creature in the traditional sense, but rather some kind of interdimensional being that can materialize in our reality temporarily? This would explain why we never find bodies despite thousands of reported sightings. It would explain the apparent violation of conservation biology. There should be a breeding population of thousands to maintain genetic viability, but we never see evidence of anything close to that number. It would explain why trail cameras almost never capture them despite covering huge areas of forest. It would explain the paranormal elements like lights, telepathy, and missing time. Under this theory, Bigfoot would be similar to UFO entities, beings from somewhere else that can briefly manifest in our physical reality, but don't permanently exist here. The footprints would be real because they left them while materialized, but the creature itself could vanish when threatened or observed too closely, slipping back into whatever dimension it came from. It's like if ghosts were real, but sometimes solid enough to leave tracks before going translucent again. Now, is this theory completely ridiculous? Yes, obviously. It violates basically every principle of conventional science and requires us to accept the existence of other dimensions, interdimensional travel, and beings that can move between realities at will. It's the kind of theory you come up with at 3 a.m. after watching too many paranormal documentaries and maybe consuming substances that aren't entirely legal. But here's the thing that makes it frustratingly hard to completely dismiss. It actually explains the data better than the "it's just an ape" theory does. If Bigfoot is just an undiscovered primate, we should have found one by now. Dead or alive, we should have definitive proof. The fact that we don't, despite extensive searching in the modern era with advanced technology, suggests that either Bigfoot doesn't exist, or it exists in a way that doesn't conform to our understanding of how physical animals work. The interdimensional theory also explains why Bigfoot sightings correlate with other paranormal activity. Areas with high Bigfoot activity often also report UFO sightings, mystery lights, and other unexplained phenomena. The conventional explanation is that these areas just attract people who believe in weird stuff, and therefore report weird stuff. But the alternative explanation is that there's actually a connection between these phenomena, that they're all manifestations of the same underlying weirdness, whatever that weirdness might be. Some researchers have gone even further and connected Bigfoot to ancient myths about star people, or sky people from various indigenous cultures. Many Native American traditions include stories about hairy giants that came from the sky or from other worlds, beings that were more spirit than flesh, that could appear and disappear, that served as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world. If you squint at these myths and modern Bigfoot reports, there are striking parallels. Powerful beings, associated with the wilderness, not quite physical, possessing abilities beyond normal animals. The Salish people of the Pacific Northwest have traditions about the Sasquatch, or Tzemekwes, describing them as spiritual beings that exist between worlds. These weren't just forest animals in their cosmology. They were entities with supernatural powers, the ability to become invisible, and a role as protectors or warnings to humans who ventured too far into the wild. The fact that modern paranormal Bigfoot reports align so well with these ancient traditions is either a fascinating cultural continuity or suggests that people have been encountering the same phenomenon for centuries and interpreting it through whatever cultural framework they had available. The problem with going down this paranormal rabbit hole is that it's basically unfalsifiable. You can't prove interdimensional beings don't exist. You can't definitively prove telepathy is impossible. You can't absolutely rule out that ancient myths were describing real encounters with otherworldly entities. The lack of evidence becomes evidence itself under this framework. Of course, we can't find physical proof if the entities aren't fully physical. It's intellectually frustrating because it's the kind of theory that explains everything and therefore explains nothing. But dismissing all the paranormal reports as hallucinations or fabrications leaves us with the equally frustrating conventional theory that there's a breeding population of giant apes in North America that nobody can definitively prove exists despite extensive searching with modern technology. That theory has its own problems. It requires us to believe that an animal that should leave extensive evidence of its existence somehow manages to avoid detection, despite thousands of witnesses, hundreds of researchers, and unlimited areas covered by trail cameras and satellite imagery. So we're stuck between two unsatisfying explanations. Either Bigfoot is an incredibly elusive physical primate that defies all efforts to document it, or it's some kind of paranormal/interdimensional phenomenon that occasionally manifests in ways that appear physical. Neither explanation is great. Both require us to accept things that seem implausible. The conventional theory asks us to believe in an impossibly stealthy ape. The paranormal theory asks us to believe in interdimensional beings and telepathic forest creatures. What makes this particularly American as a mystery is how we've industrialized even the paranormal aspects. There are Bigfoot conferences that include panels on the interdimensional hypothesis. There are apps for reporting paranormal Bigfoot encounters specifically. There are researchers with thermal cameras and EMF detectors treating Bigfoot investigation like ghost hunting in the woods. We've taken a phenomenon that most cultures would consider purely spiritual or mythological and tried to study it with scientific equipment, while also acknowledging that it might not be physical, which is peak American cognitive dissonance. The overlap between Bigfoot researchers and UFO researchers has grown significantly in recent years, with many investigators now tracking both phenomena and looking for correlations. Some areas report both Bigfoot and UFO activity in the same time periods, leading to theories about everything from alien zoo experiments to interdimensional portals that allow various entities to cross into our reality. It's like a paranormal crossover episode that nobody asked for, but everyone finds compelling anyway. And here's the ultimate question that nobody wants to answer directly. What if the weird reports are the accurate ones? What if the researchers focusing on physical evidence and treating Bigfoot like a regular animal are the ones who have it wrong? What if the people reporting telepathy and lights and dimensional shifting are actually describing the phenomenon accurately, and everyone else is trying to force something genuinely strange into a framework it doesn't fit? If Bigfoot really is interdimensional, if it really does communicate telepathically, if the encounters really do involve elements that we'd classify as paranormal rather than zoological, then our entire approach to studying it is fundamentally flawed. You can't catch an interdimensional being in a regular trap. You can't track something that doesn't leave continuous evidence. You can't photograph something that exists partially outside our normal reality. But accepting that possibility means accepting that reality is much stranger than we usually admit, that there are aspects of existence that science hasn't figured out how to measure or study, and that maybe, just maybe, the ancient myths about beings from other worlds weren't entirely metaphorical. And that's a lot more unsettling than just believing in a hairy ape that happens to be really good at hiding. So we've been on quite a journey through American mysteries, haven't we? We started with smugglers disguising profit margins as patriotism, wandered through Masonic street layouts and missing cornerstones, watched founding fathers cheat at duels and get deified on ceiling frescoes, examined monuments with secret chambers, and unrealized dirigible airports, and ended up discussing whether Bigfoot might be an interdimensional being. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're either genuinely fascinated by American weirdness, or you've committed to finishing what you started out of sheer stubbornness. Either way, I respect it. But here's the question that's been lurking beneath every chapter we've covered. Why are these still mysteries? We live in an era where we can sequence DNA from ancient bones, map the ocean floor, and track individual people through their phones. We have ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, massive databases, and more computing power in our pockets than NASA had when they sent people to the moon. Yet we still can't find the White House cornerstone. We still don't know who Agent 355 was. We still can't prove or disprove Bigfoot's existence. We still argue about whether Washington had a vision or Hamilton tried to cheat. Why? The easy answer is that we haven't looked hard enough or in the right places, that the evidence was destroyed or lost to time, that some mysteries are genuinely unsolvable because the information no longer exists. And that's probably true for some of these cases. The cornerstone might have been demolished during renovations by workers who didn't realize its significance. Agent 355's identity might have died with the only people who knew it. Bigfoot might be nothing more than misidentified bears and mass delusion. These are rational explanations, and they're probably at least partially correct. But I want to propose a different, maybe more uncomfortable answer. Some of these mysteries remain mysteries because we need them to, not because we can't solve them, but because solving them would destroy something important. The mysteries themselves have become more valuable than the answers would be. Think about it. What would actually happen if we found the White House cornerstone tomorrow and opened it up? Best case scenario, it contains exactly what we'd expect. Some construction records, maybe a newspaper, Coins from 1792, boring historical artifacts that end up in a museum where school kids on field trips will ignore them. Worst case scenario, it contains nothing, or something embarrassing, or something that contradicts our national mythology in ways we'd rather not deal with. Either way, the mystery dies, the speculation ends, the story becomes fixed instead of fluid. Right now, that cornerstone could contain anything: an alternative constitution, Masonic secrets, Washington's personal diary, the recipe for Benjamin Franklin's favourite beer. The uncertainty itself is fascinating. Once we open it, assuming we ever find it, all that potential collapses into a single reality, and chances are that reality will be disappointing compared to the possibilities we've imagined. The same logic applies to Agent 355. Right now, she could be anyone: an enslaved woman who risked everything, a society lady playing both sides, a complete fabrication. The ambiguity allows us to project onto her all our ideas about heroism, sacrifice, and the hidden roles of women and enslaved people in the Revolution. If someone definitively identified her tomorrow with documentary proof, she'd stop being a symbol and become a specific person with specific flaws and specific circumstances. She'd become smaller, more human, less mythic. Is that what we actually want? Look at what happened when the Smithsonian discovered the hair trigger in Hamilton's dueling pistols. Did it fundamentally change how we think about Hamilton and Burr? Not really. The discovery was made in 1976, and yet the traditional narrative, noble Hamilton martyred by villainous Burr, persists in popular culture to this day. We even made a massively successful musical about it that mostly ignores the hair trigger revelation. We had evidence that complicated the story, and we collectively decided to keep telling the simpler, more morally satisfying version anyway. This is what humans do. We need our heroes to be heroic and our villains to be villainous. We need our founding to be noble rather than mercenary. We need our mysteries to remain mysterious because the questions are more useful than the answers would be. The myths we build around these mysteries serve purposes that facts would undermine. America is unique in how consciously and deliberately it was constructed on myths and symbols from the very beginning. Most nations evolved over centuries, their origin stories emerging gradually and organically from collective memory. But America was founded by people who were very aware they were creating something new, and they deliberately built mythology into the structure from day one. The Masonic symbolism in Washington, D.C. isn't accidental or hidden. It's openly there, carved into stone and laid out in streets, because the founders wanted to create a capital that would inspire awe and convey their philosophical ideals for centuries to come. They weren't trying to hide their beliefs. They were broadcasting them in the language of sacred geometry and classical architecture, creating a city that would function as a constant reminder of the principles they claimed to value. The monuments we've discussed, the Washington Monument with its Egyptian solar worship, Mount Rushmore with its secret chamber, the Capitol with its deification of Washington, these weren't accidents either. They were deliberate attempts to create an American mythology comparable to ancient civilizations. The founders and the generations that followed wanted America to have the same gravitas, the same sense of timeless importance, as Egypt or Rome or Greece. So they copied the architectural forms and wrapped them around American subjects. Even the mysteries that emerged later, like Bigfoot, serve a function in American culture. We're a nation that conquered a continent, mapped every inch, eliminated most of the genuine wilderness, and turned nature into something you visit on weekends with GPS coordinates. Bigfoot represents the possibility that there's still something unknown out there, something wild that refuses to be categorized and controlled. Whether Bigfoot exists physically or not, the idea of Bigfoot is essential to a certain American self-image, that we haven't completely tamed everything, that mystery still lurks in the forests. The paranormal elements we discussed in the last chapter, interdimensional beings, telepathic communication, connections to UFO phenomena, these aren't bugs in the Bigfoot story, they're features. They keep the mystery from being solved. Every time someone tries to approach Bigfoot scientifically as just an undiscovered ape, the evidence refuses to cooperate in ways that suggest something weirder is happening. And instead of concluding, therefore it doesn't exist, many people conclude, therefore it exists in a way we don't understand. The mystery deepens rather than resolves. This is the pattern across all the mysteries we've covered. They resist solution not because solving them is impossible, but because the culture that generated them needs them to remain mysterious. The ambiguity is the point. The speculation is the point. The endless debates and theories and investigations are the point. Actually finding answers would end the game, and we're not ready for the game to end. Consider the smuggler patriots who started the revolution. The myth is noble idealists fighting for freedom. The reality includes self-interested merchants protecting their illegal profits. Both are true, but the myth serves American identity better than the complicated truth does. So the myth persists even though the historical evidence clearly shows the economic motivations. We teach the myth in schools because we need heroes more than we need accurate history. Or think about Washington at Valley Forge. Did he have an angelic vision? Almost certainly not. But the myth of the vision serves to sanctify American suffering and suggest divine approval for the national project. It's more useful than the truth, which is that a competent military leader held his army together through terrible conditions using determination and good timing. Competence isn't as inspiring as divine intervention, so we tell the story that inspires even though it's probably false. The Hamilton-Burr duel is another perfect example. We've known about the hair trigger since 1976, but we still tell the story where Hamilton is the noble victim. Why? Because that version of the story teaches the lesson we want to teach about the tragedy of dueling and the loss of one of our great founding minds. Admitting that Hamilton might have tried to cheat and accidentally killed himself would make the story messier and less morally clear, so we stick with the version that makes emotional sense, even if it's not entirely factually accurate. The pattern holds for the monuments too. We could acknowledge that the Washington Monument is weird, that copying Egyptian sun worship architecture for a democratic president is contradictory and bizarre. But that would require confronting the cognitive dissonance at the heart of how America sees itself, as both democratic and exceptional, as both republican and deserving of imperial glory, as both modern and heir to ancient civilizations. It's easier to just not think too hard about why we built a giant obelisk and focus on the height being impressive. Mount Rushmore's sealed Hall of Records is fascinating because it actually does exist. They put records in there in 1998, but nobody talks about it. Why? Probably because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging how megalomaniacal Borglum's vision was, how much cultural destruction was involved in carving indigenous sacred mountains, how the monument represents both national pride and national guilt. Simultaneously. Easier to just appreciate the big stone heads and not dig deeper into what they represent. This brings us to the central question. Do we actually want to solve these mysteries? Really? Or do we prefer having them unsolved because the mystery itself is what makes them significant? If someone found Agent 355's identity tomorrow with absolute proof, it would be a historical discovery that makes headlines for maybe a week, gets added to textbooks as a footnote, and then becomes just another historical fact that most people forget. But as long as she remains unknown, she represents all the invisible people who shaped history without recognition. She's more powerful as a symbol than she would be as a documented individual. If we found the White House cornerstone and it contained an alternative constitution, that would be genuinely earth-shattering and would require us to completely reconsider our founding. If it contained boring construction records, it would be disappointing and anticlimactic. Neither outcome is as compelling as the current state where it could be anything. The Schrodinger's cat of historical artifacts, simultaneously containing everything and nothing until we observe it. If someone definitively proved Bigfoot doesn't exist, it would end a cultural phenomenon that generates jobs, research, tourism, entertainment, and a sense of wonder for millions of people. If someone proved Bigfoot does exist and is just a regular primate, it would be scientifically interesting but would destroy all the paranormal mythology that makes Bigfoot culturally significant beyond mere zoology. In either case, the mystery dies, and with it dies all the cultural meaning we've built around that mystery. So maybe these mysteries persist not because they can't be solved, but because solving them would destroy the cultural functions they serve. The mysteries bind us together as Americans who share these common questions about our history and our land. They give us something to speculate about, argue about, investigate, make documentaries about. They provide narrative hooks that keep people engaged with American history and culture in ways that straightforward facts wouldn't. Think about it. You've just read or listened to 12 chapters about American mysteries. Would you have been as engaged if this was 12 chapters of definitively answered historical questions? Chapter 1. The Economic Causes of the American Revolution Fully Explained. Chapter 6. A complete architectural survey of Washington, D.C. with all symbolism catalogued. These would be useful but not particularly gripping. The uncertainty is what makes the stories compelling. America is a nation that built itself deliberately rather than evolving organically, and part of that deliberate construction was building in mysteries and symbols that would engage future generations. Whether this was conscious planning or just how things worked out, the result is the same. We have a national mythology full of gaps and ambiguities that allow for endless interpretation and reinterpretation. The myths serve important functions. They inspire patriotism, provide moral lessons, create shared cultural touchstones, and allow each generation to reinterpret the founding in ways that speak to their contemporary concerns. The ambiguities allow the myths to be flexible, to mean different things to different people, to evolve as American culture evolves while still claiming continuity with the past. This is both brilliant and kind of manipulative when you think about it. By building mysteries into the foundation, literally in the case of the cornerstone, figuratively in the case of the symbolic architecture, the founders created a nation that would constantly engage with its own origins without ever fully understanding them. Every generation gets to rediscover the mysteries, form new theories, and feel like they might be the ones to finally solve what previous generations couldn't. It's the historical equivalent of a really good mystery novel, except the novel is the entire country, and the mystery is everything about how and why it was created. And like any good mystery, solving it completely would be less satisfying than the process of trying to solve it. The investigation is the entertainment. The theories are the point. The definitive answer, if we ever got one, would just mean the story was over. So here we are at the end of this marathon through American mysteries, and the biggest mystery of all might be why we've collectively agreed to keep these stories mysterious when we have the tools and resources to investigate them thoroughly. Maybe it's because we understand, on some level, that the mysteries themselves are part of what makes America America, a nation built on symbols, sustained by myths, perpetually mysterious to itself. The smugglers who became patriots, the Masonic architects who encoded secrets in street layouts, the missing cornerstones and hidden chambers, the monuments that reach toward heaven while invoking ancient earthbound civilizations, the interdimensional forest creatures, all of these mysteries serve the same function. They remind us that American history is stranger and more complex than the simple stories we tell ourselves. They invite endless investigation and speculation, and they bind us together as a nation of people who share these unsolved puzzles. Maybe we don't need answers. Maybe the questions are enough. Maybe America is most American when it's mysterious to itself, when each generation can look at the same symbols and monuments and mysteries and find new meanings, new theories, new reasons to engage with the past. The cornerstone stays lost. Agent 355 stays anonymous. Bigfoot stays unproven, and we stay fascinated, searching, speculating, arguing, and ultimately connecting with each other through our shared curiosity about the nation we inherited and the secrets it still keeps. That's America, a country that built itself on questions disguised as answers, on mysteries pretending to be explanations, on myths that serve as foundations. And maybe that's exactly how the founders wanted it, or maybe it just worked out that way. Either way, the mystery continues, the search goes on, and somehow that feels more right than any definitive answer ever could. Thanks for joining me on this journey through America's biggest mysteries. Whether you came for the history, stayed for the weirdness, or just wanted to know what the heck was up with that interdimensional Bigfoot chapter, I appreciate you making it to the end. The mysteries aren't going anywhere, but hopefully now you see them a little differently, not as failures to find truth, but as essential features of the American story that keep us perpetually engaged with our own strange, symbolic, mysterious national identity. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one who finally finds the cornerstone, identifies Agent 355, or catches Bigfoot on camera. Stranger things have happened in American history. I mean, we started as smugglers mad about tea prices and ended up as a superpower with Masonic street layouts and monuments to deified presidents. If that can happen, anything's possible.